Hello and welcome. I'm Nadira Tudor and you're watching W News. Broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters, these are our top stories. Donald Trump's latest White House appointment sends shockwaves through Washington as controversial Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz is chosen as Attorney General. British Defence Secretary John Healey travels to Turkey and Saudi Arabia to discuss ceasefire possibilities in the Middle East. And Israeli President Benjamin Netanyahu has reportedly proposed a Lebanon ceasefire deal in January as a so-called gift to Donald Trump. We start with the United States, and President-elect Donald Trump's cabinet is taking shape and making headlines stateside following a series of controversial picks for senior positions. In assembling his team for a second term, Trump is sticking with loyalists but faces a potential backlash from his own lawmakers, as Benji Haya reports.
The 47th President of the United States, Donald J. Trump.
If you thought Donald Trump might conform to the Washington playbook, then think again. After a series of more traditional cabinet selections, he's reverted to the unconventional, nominating Tulsi Gabbard as his Director of National Intelligence. The former Democratic Party congresswoman has expressed sympathetic views on Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad and Russia's leader Vladimir Putin. So much so that she's been described on Russian TV as an agent of Moscow.
The Tulsi Gabbard appointment really casts a very negative light on everything else. Because how can you have someone who has shown herself to be so irresponsible from a national security point of view, sitting in the Situation Room during a National Security Council meeting, which is where she will be, and think that you're going to get a positive results out of that? I mean, that to me is extraordinarily concerning.
Gaetz.
Then there's this man.
Donald John Trump.
Matt Gaetz. Trump wants him to be Attorney General in charge of America's justice system. A fierce ally of the former president, he's stood by him during his criminal trials.
This is a made-up crime. No other American in the country would be charged with this type of crime. It's like the Mr. Potato Head doll of crimes, where they had to stick together a bunch of things that did not belong together.
As Attorney General, Gaetz would have the power and will to shut down Trump's remaining criminal cases, consigning them to the ash heap of history. But he's faced his own legal challenges too, as the subject of a congressional ethics investigation into allegations of sexual misconduct, illicit drug use and misuse of campaign funds. By resigning from Congress yesterday, he may have prevented the release of any findings. Yet his bombastic approach means he has no shortage of enemies on Capitol Hill, including within his own party. It means getting approved by the Senate is a tall order, even if Republicans control that chamber, as well as, it was confirmed on Wednesday, the House of Representatives, granting Trump the much-coveted trifecta, command of all branches of government to enact his MAGA agenda unencumbered.
Republicans in the House and Senate have a mandate. It's true. It was a decisive win across the nation. The American people want us to implement and deliver that America First agenda. And we have to do that while we have that energy and that excitement beginning on the very first day of the Congress in the new year.
At the White House transition yesterday, something he denied President Joe Biden last time, Donald Trump said politics is tough and not a very nice world. A message perhaps to those who try to stand in his way. Benji Haya, Al Arabiya News, Washington.
For more analysis, let's speak to our chief correspondent, Simon Marks, in Washington now. Simon, you've obviously been following the US president-elect very closely. Trump's latest move has tapped Matt Gaetz for Attorney General. Why has he been chosen for this role, as it's a pretty controversial appointment, isn't it?
Well, it certainly is, Nadira. I mean, it has been a very long while in this city since both sides of the political divide up on Capitol Hill, Republican and Democrats, have gathered together for a good old laugh. And they really have been doing that over the last 24 hours since the appointment, the nomination of Matt Gaetz to be America's next Attorney General. Democrats, because they think that he is absolutely, completely unqualified for the role. I mean, he is a lawyer, but that's about it. But Republicans, because in large measure, they all loathe him. I mean, there is no more unpopular figure in the House of Representatives within the Republican Party than Matt Gaetz, because of the endless machinations that he's put the Republican caucus through in various challenges to now 2 successive speakers of the House of Representatives. So there's absolutely no love lost between Matt Gaetz and anyone else in elected office here in Washington, D.C. And of course, he's got that House Ethics Committee investigation hanging over him into alleged impropriety, alleged inappropriate conduct with a minor. There are also allegations that he watched pornography on the floor of the House of Representatives, and allegations concerning the possible misuse of campaign funds to pay personal bills. He resigned from Congress last night after Donald Trump sort of threw him the lifeline in the form of this nomination. But one of the reasons he did that was to hold up the outcome of that Ethics Committee investigation and the report that was about to be published. So it is very, very hard to see how Matt Gaetz and some of these other nominees stands any chance whatsoever of securing Senate confirmation. Remember that anyone who is going to sit in Donald Trump's cabinet, any U.S. ambassador nominated by Donald Trump, or any federal judge nominated by Donald Trump after he takes office, they all have to go through confirmation hearings unless Donald Trump can persuade the new leader of the Republicans in the Senate, Senator John Thune of South Dakota, to agree to recess appointments. If Senator Thune will agree to that, and it's a huge if, Matt Gaetz could become the next Attorney General of the United States through a recess appointment, and he could be sitting atop the Department of Justice for 2 years. But that is going to require John Thune giving a massive gift to President-elect Donald Trump. And it's a real loyalty test, all of this, for John Thune and other Republicans in the Senate who recoil at the idea of Matt Gaetz becoming Attorney General.
Simon, you couldn't have been clearer. I mean, the phrasing that you've used, you know, people having a good old laugh, not having, well, zero support, pretty much. It's not looking too promising for Matt Gaetz, but why on earth would Donald Trump put him forward then?
Oh, because they're like-minded. I mean, because Matt Gaetz takes the view, as Donald Trump takes the view, that his legal woes, Matt Gaetz says exactly the same thing about his legal woes, they're all the result of a weaponized Department of Justice. And one of the reasons why Donald Trump is turning to Matt Gaetz is because if the president-elect, after he takes the oath of office on January the 20th of next year, if he wants to go ahead immediately with his promise to terminate the traditional independence of the Department of Justice, not the constitutionally guaranteed independence, because it isn't, it's simply traditional independence of the Department of Justice. To do that, then the president-elect needs a completely compliant Attorney General. And in Matt Gaetz, he's got that. They are also aligned in their viewpoint, their desire to use the Department of Justice to go after some of the people that have made their own lives miserable through the prosecutions and the investigations that have been launched against them. So for Donald Trump, Matt Gaetz is extremely useful, but only if he can find a way of putting him into that Attorney General position, which is, I would say at the moment, looking unlikely. But again, it depends on whether Senator Thune agrees to recess appointments or not.
Simon Marks in Washington, thank you. Now, London is bracing for significant changes to American policy on issues the UK is heavily invested in following the US election. The British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, welcomed President-elect Trump and said he looked forward to working with him. But there are uncertainties for the UK government as Donald Trump prepares his new administration. Stuart Smith has more from London.
President-elect Donald Trump has many times openly declared his love for tariffs as a preferred tool of geopolitics.
If China or some other country is behaving badly, we have things called tariffs that are so severe.
He's suggested those could be imposed at 10% on all imports to the US. In that scenario, Goldman Sachs expects the British economy would suffer a 0.7 percentage point hit to GDP growth. Being outside the European Union, however, a political bloc Donald Trump has been particularly critical of, could avoid even greater damage.
So one advantage for the UK being outside the EU trading zone is that if there is any significant tit-for-tat trade war between the EU and the United States, the UK should escape some, but not all of the effects of that. But the UK is still going to be closely affected by any generalised tariffs that the Trump administration might introduce, or indeed further protectionist measures that the US might take to restrict market access to US customers.
Politicians in London are worried enough, though, that they've hinted reciprocal tariffs are being considered, just in case.
You know, it's a trade relationship with the United States, and we will make, strong representations about the importance of free and open trade, not just between ourselves and the United States, but globally.
Britain may also come under pressure from Washington to concede on other areas important to a Trump White House. For example, on the UK government's attempts to have a more pragmatic approach to China, which might precede revived trade, or climate policy, on which the UK is trying hard to brand itself as a world leader. Another worry for London is whether Donald Trump will reduce support for Ukraine or push it into an unfavourable deal with Russia. London, like many European capitals, sees Ukrainian success against the Russian invasion as essential for European security more broadly. That also explains concerns in Britain about the new president lessening support for the NATO military alliance. And since the US election, the UK government's coming under increasing pressure domestically to set out when it will increase its own defence spending as a proportion of GDP.
Perhaps the hardest part for officials here at the Foreign Ministry is they simply don't know yet what foreign policy Donald Trump is committed to, or what the famously transactional president will be willing to do deals on. Stuart Smith, Arabiya News, London.
Well, let's speak to our correspondent in London, Olly Barratt now. Olly, we were just hearing about Britain's reaction to the potential Trump tariffs, but the crisis in the Middle East is also a priority for the UK government. The British Defence Secretary, John Healey, has been discussing ceasefire efforts today. What do we know about that?
That's right. We know that John Healey, on his visits to Turkey and Saudi Arabia, has been stressing that progress towards a ceasefire in Gaza and in Lebanon is one of the key objectives of this trip. We're also told that it's broadly about meeting with key allies when it comes to defence cooperation as well. But the UK making it very clear that it's pressing in discussions on this trip from John Healey to try and move some progress towards a ceasefire in Gaza and Lebanon. So a central part of the trip as briefed by the Ministry of Defence here in London.
Yeah, we've been hearing that Healey intended to reaffirm the UK's support for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, as you mentioned. How much international influence, though, does he and the UK have on this matter?
I think it's fair to say that the UK has not been able to exert much influence so far in this sphere, in this realm, over the calls for a ceasefire. Now, that's partly because there are other more influential actors when it comes to these matters, the United States, just as one example. But the UK does feel that it has some diplomatic sway and can play an important role in these discussions with partners like Saudi Arabia, with partners like Turkey as well. Domestically, the UK government and the government before, led by the outgoing Conservative Prime Minister Riz Khan, came under significant pressure domestically from some quarters for not doing enough to push quickly enough for a ceasefire. Certainly, the UK government has always said that when it comes to a ceasefire, ensure that any plan would be linked to the release of Israeli hostages by Hamas. It also says that it would be linked to improving the in a humanitarian situation inside Gaza as well. So the UK has had limited success, it's fair to say, so far when it comes to pushing for a ceasefire in Gaza and in Lebanon latterly too, but wants to make sure that it does keep pushing. And as I say, it does have some ability diplomatically to exert some influence in trying to move that process forwards, although with no concrete results so far, I think it's fair to say.
Thank you, Olly. Barratt in London. Apologies for a bit of the sound there, but we'll move on. Thank you, Olly. Thanks. Now let's have a look at some other news making headlines around the world. A man who attempted to attack Brazil's Supreme Court in Brasilia last night is believed to have been killed from his own explosives. Police have named the suspect as Francisco Wanderlei Luiz, who had previously stood in council elections for the Liberal Party. His body was found outside the building after the explosions were detonated. No one else was hurt. Argentinian representatives have left COP29 early after being given orders to return by their president Javier Milei. The team left the Global Climate Change Summit in Azerbaijan just 3 days into the two-week event. Milei has previously called the climate crisis a social lie. In South Korea, 1 million students are currently sitting the Sunyung, an 8-hour university placement exam said to be the toughest in the world. During this time, planes are grounded, construction work is paused and car horns are silenced in order to give those taking part complete focus. It's a countrywide effort with shops open late and extra public transport introduced to reduce traffic congestion. And the Phoenix Police Department have released incredible body cam rescue footage of a man who had driving his vehicle into a pool. The officer smashed the sunroof of the submerged car to get to the man inside. He's now recovering in a hospital in Arizona. The Washington Post has reported today that a close aide of Benjamin Netanyahu has told Donald Trump that Israel would like to make Lebanon's ceasefire deal in January as a gift to the incoming president. Trump had said repeatedly during the election campaign that he wants to bring to an end the wars in the Middle East and could be one of his first foreign policy wins when he assumes power. This comes as 6 Israeli soldiers were killed fighting Hezbollah in southern Lebanon last Wednesday, one of the deadliest single days for the IDF since the start of the operation. For more on this, I'm joined from our correspondent, Giles Gibson in Tel Aviv. Now, Giles, we've heard contradictory statements over the past few days regarding a ceasefire in Lebanon. Today, the Washington Post reports that Israeli officials are working to time any ceasefire deal as a gift for Donald Trump, officially assuming the presidency in January. Can you confirm the details on this?
So far, we just have this reporting from the Washington Post that the Israeli minister Ron Dermer met with Donald Trump as well as his son-in-law Jared Kushner at the Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida just last Sunday. According to these reports, they discussed a potential deal under which Hezbollah forces would pull back behind the Litani River, which is the northern part of the buffer zone that is policed by UN peacekeepers in southern Lebanon. And also part of this deal would be Israeli forces having the option to cross back into Lebanon. Freedom, it's described at, the freedom to do that if there are violations of this ceasefire deal. And finally, the sort of really interesting part of this reported deal is that Russia would also be involved. Russian forces in Syria policing arms or weapons, stopping weapons coming from Syria into Lebanon and then getting into the hands of Hezbollah.
So how accurate is the report of Israel's gift suggestions, and has there been reaction from the international community?
Really, this report has been met by a wall of silence in terms of the people who are mentioned in this story. You have Ron Dermer's office, the Israeli minister, saying that they simply discussed a wide range of issues on his recent trip to the US. The offices of Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, as well as President-elect Trump, declining to comment on this story whatsoever, and also spokespeople for Jared Kushner, as well as the Russian Foreign Ministry, just not responding to requests for comment. I think one thing, though, that this story does do is it sparks this question, really, is in terms of what the Israeli government is doing, in terms of, is it running two tracks in terms of speaking to the Biden administration and the incoming Trump administration about a potential ceasefire deal, or do some of these details kind of mix in between them?
Yeah, it's a bit confusing, isn't it, at the moment, Giles? The Foreign Ministry of the Palestinian Authority has suggested today that Israeli ministers have been outlining their ambition to fully and permanently annex the Israeli-occupied West Bank as a test of international reaction. Is this something the Israeli government is preparing to do?
Well, it's something that senior ministers within the government are openly talking about. Just a few days ago, we had the far-right finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, who also has settlements as part of his ministerial portfolio, saying that he had told his government department to prepare the necessary infrastructure for applying sovereignty to the West Bank. We have to stress, though, that other very senior members of this government have sort of not quite directly but indirectly pushed back against that. We had the foreign minister, Gideon Saar, saying in response to that there's been no decision taken about this. And of course, if the Israeli government were to move forward with anything along those lines that Smotrich is talking about, then there would be immediate international condemnation from places like the United Nations and the European Union.
Now, Giles, a Human Rights Watch report has accused Israel of crimes against humanity over its policy of forcing the displacement of people in Gaza. What's been the reaction to their accusations?
Yeah, this report is 154 pages. The kind of headline is that 1.9 million Palestinians have been displaced. They say that makes up 90% of the population of Gaza. In this report, they talk about forced displacement being widespread, systematic, and part of state policy. Now, there has not been an immediate response to this report from Human Rights Watch by the Israeli government or indeed from the Israeli Defense Forces, but we have to say that in previous instances when they have been accused of this particular war crime, they have always said that they deny anything along those lines and that Israeli forces always stick to international law.
OK, we'll leave it there. Giles Gibson in Tel Aviv. Thank you very much. Now let's have a look at some other news making headlines around the world. Security is being stepped up in Paris tonight as the city prepares for a football match between Israel and France. 4,000 police officers will be deployed to the capital. Dozens of arrests were made last Thursday following a match in Amsterdam involving Israeli team Maccabi Tel Aviv. Officials say the attacks on Israeli supporters were anti-Semitic, whilst Tel Aviv fans were accused of singing anti-Arab songs. Sticking with France, and former presidential candidate Marine Le Pen could be jailed for up to 5 years after being accused of embezzling EU funds. The far-right leader and Paris prosecutor could also face a 5-year ban from political office. She denies the charges. And the former president of Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, is set to visit Nova Scotia in Canada next week to deliver a speech at the Halifax International Security Forum. Tsai stepped down in May and has defiantly stood against China's military threat. She's exchanged economic and political conversations with Canada, despite the countries having no diplomatic ties. Ukraine's foreign ministry has denied the country is planning on building nuclear weapons as it continues its fight against Russia. It comes as reports claim President-elect Donald Trump could soon select a Ukrainian peace envoy to lead negotiations to end the war. For more analysis of what a second Trump administration means for Ukraine, I'm joined from Kyiv by Ukrainian MP for the European Solidarity Party, Alexi Goncharenko. Mr. Goncharenko, firstly, what were your thoughts upon seeing the news that Donald Trump had won the election?
It's the choice of American people, so I can only congratulate Mr. Trump and Republican Party for such a big success. He won election of president. Also, they won the Congress. And we're looking forward to work together with them because the United States of America are super important ally for Ukraine. But I think that Ukraine is also an important ally for the United States of America.
Now, Donald Trump has signalled his intention to end the war in Ukraine in one day. Would you agree that this is perhaps slightly ambitious, and how realistic were his comments?
Nobody in the world wants the end of the war more than Ukrainians, because we are suffering every day, we are dying every day. We are very exhausted by this war. So it's absolutely a good intention from the President Trump to end the war. The question is how to do this. That's very important. Also, it's very important to have real peace, not a ceasefire, because ceasefire is not something we're looking for, and I'm sure President Trump too. So there are many, many questions what exactly President Trump is going to do. Yes, there are news that he will soon appoint some envoy who will start some diplomatic activity in this direction. That's a good news, and we are looking forward to see who it will be and how this person will start to operate.
Yes. Now, President Zelensky had rebuffed this notion of a 24-hour peace deal, suggesting last week in Budapest that he wanted a fair deal. It'd be useful to understand what that fair deal would look like and what are some of the very firm red lines for Ukraine. So let's start off with the fair deal. What does that look like?
The fair deal for Ukraine is very clear. It's restoration of our territorial integrity. And it's important not just for Ukraine, for every country in the world, because it's about international order and international law. I don't think that somebody wants to live in the world where law does mean nothing. That's all. And that's what will be if the territorial integrity of Ukraine will not be finally restored. So this is a fair peace. And also it should include security guarantees for our country, understanding that this attack from Russian Federation will not be repeated. That's how the fair deal from Ukrainian point of view looks like.
And what are the red lines for Ukraine?
I'm not the person who can speak on behalf of the whole Ukraine and on behalf of the president or the government. I can tell you what I think is a red line. As I told you, we will never accept the fact that occupied territories are Russian. That's a red line. We need security guarantees. This is a red line, because the Budapest Memorandum, which we had in 1994, just was a disaster for Ukraine. And we need real guarantees, not some papers like it happened, they were in Budapest 30 years ago. I just want to remind that Ukraine, for the first time in human history, voluntarily gave up nuclear weaponry, the third biggest arsenal in the world, in exchange for these papers, which in the end of the day appear to be absolutely nothing. So we will never, we don't want this to happen again. So we need real security guarantees. The best way is membership of Ukraine in NATO.
You've been really clear about what those red lines are from your perspective. Do you think there's been a shift, therefore, in the thinking in Kyiv regarding a peace deal with Russia? Are both sides ready to commit to some kind of deal?
Again, I can speak here on behalf of myself only and what I see. We want to regain our territorial integrity. But the question is, by what means? Can we do it militarily? To do it militarily, we need full support of our allies, and first of all, of the United States of America. Is the United States of America ready to provide us with this support after election of Mr. Trump? What will be his policy? We just don't know for the moment. So it depends. What will be the policy of President Trump? Also, a lot of will depend from how his conversation with Putin will go. Because I'm sure that President Trump will try to make a deal with Putin. But how they see this deal, I think it's quite different. How Trump sees it and how Putin sees it, it's very different. And I think if their conversation and this attempt to make a deal with Putin, if it will show to Donald Trump that Putin is not a reliable partner, that he is just a crazy dictator with whom he can't make a deal, I think his attitude and his strategy towards Russia can change dramatically. And I think that Donald Trump is a kind of person who can make a very bold steps. To bomb Moscow, I think Donald Trump can do this. I'm not sure about other politicians in America or anybody else in the world, but I think Donald Trump potentially is ready. But will he do this? How he will act? I just don't know. And I don't want to show that I know. But I mean, a lot of will depend from how this conversation between Trump and Putin will go.
Well, none of us know, but Ukrainian MP for the European Solidarity Party, Alexi Goncharenko, thank you very much for talking to us on the programme.
Thank you.
To Germany now, and Chancellor Olaf Schultz continues to fight for survival and keep himself in a job after being forced to call a snap election. Addressing Parliament, the German leader appealed to potential voters by promising to bring in child benefits and increase tax thresholds before the country goes to the polls in February. Our correspondent Trent Murray is in Berlin for us and joins us now. Trent, Schultz has said Germans don't need to choose between security and prosperity. How's that gone down there?
Well, Chancellor Schultz was criticised by many in the opposition for that comment. Effectively, they said that the prosperity part doesn't come without the security to protect it. What they're talking about, of course, is Germany's continued support for Ukraine, particularly financially and militarily. We know right now there are some difficult discussions taking place because of the collapse of Olaf Scholz's government. So too has his legislative agenda collapsed, and that includes bills for further funding for Ukraine. He made a pretty impassioned statement there in the German Bundestag, effectively defending his legacy, but also calling for some of the opposition parties to try and support some of those social benefits that you mentioned through the parliament. The difficulty right now is he just no longer has a minority. He is a chancellor leading a minority government, and he needs that opposition support to get through those policies. But from what we are seeing, the opposition certainly is not wanting to play ball. The opposition leader said that his MPs are not substitute players for the collapse of Olaf Scholz's government.
Now, it's a really interesting situation in Germany in terms of public sentiment as the far-right party, for example, the AfD, managed to claim a substantial number of seats in 2017, lost a few now, but they're still the fifth largest party in the country. Has Trump's recent win, do you think, reinvigorated those inclined to vote for the right?
Well, look, I think it's certainly put the wind in their sails. I mean, the AfD leadership were quick out of the gates to congratulate President-elect Donald Trump, releasing a statement saying that just like Germans, US citizens have had enough of national debt, economic decline, endless wars and illegal immigration. They certainly think the types of messages that President Trump deployed on his campaign could be a winning message here. We know the AfD is polling quite well. They're currently second in the polls behind the main conservative CDU party, and they have done quite well at the ballot box in recent months in 3 state elections, even winning one state, the state of Thuringia. So right now their support is quite concentrated in those areas which form the part of East Germany, the former communist East. Can they extend that lead into other parts of the country? That's the big unknown right now. But what we do know is that all of the mainstream parties, including the Conservatives, have said that they just will not work with the AfD to try and form a coalition, effectively an agreement between the parties to build a firewall to ensure that the far right doesn't form government here in any way in Germany.
It'd be interesting to see what happens. Trent, currently the polls are not in Scholz's favour. Is there any chance of a comeback?
I think it will be very difficult. I mean, right now, the smart money in Berlin certainly seems to be banking on the opposition leader, Friedrich Merz, winning that snap election in February. We know that he is currently leading by about 20 points ahead of Olaf Scholz's SPD. And I think staring at some of those numbers and the possibility of being thrust into electoral oblivion, I should say, oblivion rather, we know there is some disquiet inside the SPD party right now, even conversations happening about maybe changing the leader. Right now, Olaf Scholz, though, is hanging on, but some of his own MPs have now gone public saying that they should substitute him with the highly popular Defence Minister, Boris Pistorius. For the time being, the Defence Minister says he is not running.
Trent Murray in Berlin, thank you for talking to us. Thank you. Let's have a look at some of the top business news now. British consumer rights company Which is suing Apple for around £3 billion for the way they charge customers for its iCloud storage. The lawsuit claims Apple has breached UK competition law and accused them of trapping users with Apple devices into signing up for it. If successful, 40 million Apple customers may receive a payout. In addition, the European Commission has fined Facebook's parent company Meta $841 million for breaching EU competition law benefiting Facebook Marketplace. The EU has accused Meta of abusing its dominant market position on social media networks and in online advertising. UK fashion label Burberry plans on using its British heritage to claw back customers. The luxury firm will concentrate on its classic trench coats and scarves rather than bags and shoes in an attempt to ramp up revenue. The company's new CEO, Joshua Schulman, revealed his plans to turn around the brand with a £40 million cost savings programme after reporting a loss for the first half of the financial year. To sports news now, and social media star Jake Paul is gearing up for his Friday night fight with boxing legend Mike Tyson. The 27-year-old is 30 years younger than Iron Mike, who's returning to the ring after 19 years. And ex-footballer Diego Forlan's professional tennis debut has ended in disappointment on the ATP Challenger Tour. The former Manchester United and Atletico Madrid striker and his doubles partner Federico Coria lost 6-1, 6-2 to Bolivian pair Boris Arias and Federico Zeballos during a 47-minute long match. And in showbiz news tonight, fashion and entertainment collided in Saudi Arabia's capital for an unforgettable event. The 1001 Seasons of Elisar, part of Riyadh season 2024, showcased 300 stunning gowns by the legendary Lebanese designer who's celebrating 45 years in fashion. Stars like Celine Dion, Jennifer Lopez and Monica Bellucci lit up the night in tribute to the tales of 1001 nights. Saudi Arabia's General Entertainment Authority Chairman Turki Al Sheikh told Al Arabiya how he initiated the idea for this event to Eli Saab and his son in London, adding that he's proud Arab like Saab has achieved such remarkable success in the fashion world.
I hope that the event will meet your expectations. This is the effort of Eli Saab and his son Eli Jr. They are Arab designers whom we are proud of. Eli's beginning was in Riyadh in 1982, and today he returns to Riyadh with the 1001 Nights, and hopefully you will see surprises. Entertainment includes everything in society. I am now discussing with Eli Jr. next year's event. It happened during a meeting in London between us, and at the beginning they didn't believe the idea, but day after day the idea was developed. Honestly, I am proud that an Arab person has reached this place.
Let's have a reminder of our top stories. Donald Trump's latest White House appointment sends shockwaves through Washington as controversial Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz is chosen as Attorney General. British Defence Secretary John Healey travels to Turkey and Saudi Arabia to discuss ceasefire possibilities in the Middle East. And Israeli President Benjamin Netanyahu has reportedly proposed a Lebanon ceasefire deal in January as a so-called gift to Donald Trump. That's all from us at W News. Coming up next is Tom Burges Watson with GNT. Good night.
Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome. I'm Riz Khan in Washington, D.C., the capital of a nation that is still coming to terms with the outcome of the U.S. elections. In this episode, we'll consider the implications for this divided country, for the Democratic Party, and for conflicts in the Middle East and beyond. First up, Al Arabiya's chief correspondent, Simon Marks, has seen it all during decades of covering the political beat in Washington. But he's never seen anything quite like this. So, Simon, 8 elections you've now covered. How did this one compare with the previous one?
Well, you know, Riz, I think that it is always said every 4 years that the United States is about to engage in the most important election of everybody's lifetime, and Americans are always told, you know, the future of the country depends on the outcome of this election. This time round, it had the added benefit of being true, right? There is no question that this was the most important election any of us is ever going to cover. Because of the stakes, and the stakes are absolutely clear. We know that the Trump 2.0 administration is going to be much more radical. I mean, this is what they describe their plans to be, than its predecessor, that he's learnt from what he thinks were the mistakes of the past, which was the coming to terms with people that didn't necessarily agree with him but brought expertise to the administration. So I think that it was always apparent that this was going to be an absolutely vital campaign, and a campaign that was elemental in terms of discussing the future of American democracy. And then the twists and turns, the departure of Joe Biden from the race, the drama of that, the injection of Kamala Harris being given 107 days to try and persuade Americans to get behind her. First of all, she had to introduce herself to them. Then she had to explain her policies to them. She was better at the first part than the second part. And it all culminated with the repudiation of Democrats, both in the battle for that building, but also in the battle for Congress, for the United States Senate.
So that's what I was wondering, with those twists and turns you just described, how difficult did it make your job? Because, of course, you're always expected to be on top of things, but, you know, you wake up and things have changed that morning.
Yeah, I mean, there's no campaign where everything goes according to plan for the two candidates, and indeed the whole concept of the October surprise, which is never that much of a surprise in recent years, exists to underscore the fact that this is always going to be a deeply, deeply unpredictable campaign. But a campaign in which you see the President of the United States succumb to a cabal by members of his own political party, orchestrated by one of his best friends, Nancy Pelosi, with whom Joe Biden has not spoken since he was defenestrated. The notion that we were going to watch his rival, Donald Trump, first of all defeat him in a television debate, then survive an attempted assassination that produced some of the most iconic images any American election has ever generated. You know, him getting back on his feet, the hand in the air, fight, fight, fight. The two conventions, always great images, you know, iconic images that come out of that. The Republicans leaving their convention in Milwaukee, absolutely convinced that they had this election in the bag because they were still at the time taking on Biden, then getting knocked on the back foot by Biden being replaced by Kamala Harris, then the attempted assassination, the attempted assassination, of course, happened before the Republican convention. All of these things brought together and underscored, I think, a really brittle sense in this country that the tension, the anxiety, just the sheer length of the campaign, the amount of money that was spent on it, the fundraising itself. I mean, all of us, journalists, my wife, who's not a journalist any longer, receiving endless fundraising messages on email, on telephones. Every 10 minutes her phone was buzzing with another request for funds. It's all added to this notion of tension and unease here.
And it's all about the aftermath. One of the big worries was the country was so divided that whatever the outcome, there would be potentially violence on the streets, there would be a lot of division. What sense do you have, it's only been a few days, but what sense do you have of the aftermath?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, there's a building down there that is a commercial building that just a couple of days ago was ringed with fencing because the owners of the building were worried that, like the White House and the Vice President's residence, it could get ransacked and looted in the event of violence. That has all suddenly dissipated because really of the size of the victory. I mean, I think that this town particularly is despondent. It's a Democratic Party stronghold. There are thousands, probably tens of thousands of people here who realize they're not going to be able to stay here, partly because Donald Trump wants to replace them with ideologues, and partly because, you know, in every time there's a transition, the Republicans are coming to town, the Democrats in large measure are leaving. But I think the shock to the system of the size of the victory, the one outcome of this election that no one thought was likely was a Trump landslide. Democrats said they thought a Kamala Harris landslide might happen. Most people thought narrow win for Kamala Harris, narrow win for Donald Trump, days, weeks of tension, possible unrest, possible protest. Nobody thought it's going to be a Donald Trump landslide and it will be resolved within hours of polls closing. And that's where we are, and the Democrats have said they're going to engage in a peaceful transition. And I think that mostly in this town there will be despondency, especially when we get to January and we're going to see some very uncomfortable imagery relating to Democrats leaving the White House, the Republicans arriving. I mean, it'll be not entirely dissimilar, I suspect, to when Donald Trump came visiting the White House after his first election win, and there's this iconic picture of Obama staffers gathered on the lawn watching Trump arrive, and they all look like absolute death warmed up. And I think we're going to see similar imagery this time around.
Have you had a chance to talk to any of Donald Trump's detractors? People like John Bolton, who, you know, was terrified of, to some degree, terrified of a Trump victory because he said, you know, now this time, as you alluded to in the first part of this, that he really has a better idea of what he can do. And what have those detractors? I mean, some of them have to run for the hills according to the threats.
Well, some of them have already left town. I mean, I know of two detractors, both of whom are not in Washington, D.C. One had already decided to leave the city some years ago and just get out of Dodge altogether, and the other one of whom deliberately positioned themselves overseas during election week because they were worried about what might happen. And in the aftermath of election week is suggesting that they are going to decouple themselves from the United States and establish themselves overseas instead. I think there is going to be an awful lot of that. And I think it will be because some people physically fear their own safety. And I think it is also because lots of other people will realize that their ability to build their careers here and, you know, pay their bills and look after their families is going to be heavily constrained as a result of the outcome of this election. So they're, in many cases, looking overseas. I was talking to a friend in London earlier today who was telling me that he works for a firm that has a department that deals with expats that is apparently overrun in the last 48 hours with requests from Americans for more information about how they can move and rebase themselves in the UK. So I think you're going to see a lot of movement.
What about those who suddenly seem to side with Donald Trump, RFK Jr.,
Absolutely.
Elon Musk? I mean, those were kind of surprise twists.
Opportunity knocks, doesn't it? I mean, Jeff Bezos, you know, who stopped the Washington Post here from publishing an endorsement of Kamala Harris and sent Donald Trump congratulations messages over Elon Musk's social media platform yesterday. I mean, opportunity knocks, absolutely. Elon Musk definitely going to play some role in government. I think not in a cabinet position, because to do that he'd have to divest himself from his business interests, which seems extremely unlikely. But he's clearly going to be a Trump whisperer. RFK Jr., I mean, there is talk about becoming the Secretary of Health and Human Services. I mean, some in Trump world have denied that's the plan, but RFK Jr. keeps fueling the notion, you're going to see ideologues and some of these external figures, these characters that have attached themselves to Donald Trump like a barnacle, playing a role in the administration. I think it's absolutely vital to underscore that Trump 2.0 is not going to look anything like Trump 1.0. First Trump Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, lovely man, foisted on him by Condoleezza Rice because she said, you need a man who understands the world. Rex Tillerson, this guy from Exxon, he'll sort you out. There's going to be none of that. General Jim Mattis, James Comey at the FBI, they're not going to work with any of these people. And that's going to change the character of this city.
Having seen how tight the polls were literally up to the end, the landslide victory was, of course, that much more of a surprise. To what degree do you think it might say something about America not being ready for a woman president, as they keep saying, possibly even not one of colour?
There's no question that that was a factor. I think there are multiple factors in the Democrats' demise in this election, but misogyny and racism was clearly a substantial issue. Barack Obama himself identified particularly the racist aspect of it when he went on the campaign trail and said that black men particularly he was hearing and believing were saying that they were not ready for a black woman in power. I think the misogyny issue is strong. I'm not sure it's as strong as it was in 2016 when Hillary Clinton lost her race, but it's definitely still a factor. But the Democrats' drubbing was so comprehensive that it's about more than that. In 2020, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris won 81 million votes. 4 years later, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz won 66 million votes. That's 15 million people who have decided they don't want to vote Democratic this time round. Some of them may have racist reasons for doing that. Some of them may have misogynistic reasons for doing that. Bernie Sanders says a lot of them are members of the working class who feel that the Democratic Party has abandoned them, so they're going to abandon the Democratic Party. We know that many of them are Latino voters who are American citizens from Latino families who are hostile to the new wave of illegal immigrants coming into the country because they argue they pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps, did everything the way you were supposed to do it legally, and they support the deportation of some of these illegal immigrants. So I think that the question for the Democratic Party now is elemental. I mean, clearly so many things went so wrong, even including how long it took to put the arm on Biden to get him to abandon his re-election quest, that there's no one thing you can fix or blame. You can't say it's just misogyny or it's just racism. It is a whole packet of problems that the Democratic Party didn't see coming.
You know, Simon, there was a lot of talk about uniting the country after the election. I certainly know, I come here frequently and I sense the tensions and the divisions. Do you see any, as someone who's covered so much of this going on, do you see any signs there might be a move towards unity?
I mean, they always talk of a move towards unity after every election. And by the time the cadences of the sentence have finished echoing around the room that you're in, those calls have gone nowhere and are going to go nowhere. This is a tribal, 50-50 polarized nation. And there is nothing that the outcome of this election or Donald Trump's arrival in the White House said yesterday is going to heal the nation, said that before, then he came and made the inaugural speech about carnage in America. There's no fixing it. These are two tribal groups of followers of the Democratic Party and the new Trump-dominated Republican Party, with disaffected Republicans in the middle, not quite sure where they're going to end up. And finding common cause between any of these people is going to be difficult, and it's going to be increasingly difficult because it's geographical, right? I mean, there are places where Republicans feel comfortable and at home, and there are places where Liberal Democrats feel comfortable and at home, and the twain don't often mingle and meet. And I think there's a fundamental problem to the concept of a homogeneous society in one nation here, because it increasingly doesn't exist.
Well, of course, all the factions came out during the campaign. You saw the Arab Americans, black Americans and so on. The Arab American story was an interesting one. How many people actually decided to support Trump from the Arab American community? Some people believe it's because of the backlash due to the lack of action taken by the Biden administration with the Israel-Gaza conflict. And some just, I guess, feel that Donald Trump is going to be someone who represents them better. He's promised to stop all wars in a day, basically. But they're going to have to face the consequences of what he does or doesn't do now.
Yes, and remember that he's talked about possibly reimposing his Muslim travel ban, which is going to have an enormous community impact on the Arab American community. But, I mean, the Arab American community in this election played a fascinating role because they essentially said to the Democratic Party, enough. For 3 election cycles now, Barack Obama has gone to all Democrats and said, you may be disappointed in what we've done. Perhaps we haven't delivered on the things that you wanted, but you've got to vote for us because we're better than this guy, right? The Arab American community and other Democrats furious over Gaza in this election said, no, we're not going there. We're not doing it again. Bill Clinton traveled to Michigan days before the election and said to the Arab American community, Kamala Harris has said she's going to do what she can do to end the war, and she's going to try and advance the prospects of peace through diplomacy. That ought to be enough. That was the phrase he used to Arab American voters. Get over it. It ought to be enough. And it wasn't enough. And they had Jill Stein in Michigan, third-party candidate, appealing for their support. You can deny Kamala Harris the White House by voting for me if you don't want to vote for Donald Trump. And it proved to be effective. And I think that message to Democrats is a broader message than one that's just coming from the Arab American community. You can't keep saying, vote for us, because you may not like us very much, and we may have disappointed you, but we're still better than the alternative. They have to go back into the kitchen and cook up a better proposition than that for 2028.
Having followed all the promises, and of course they are just campaign promises, what are you expecting to occur in this coming year, for example, or say post-January in 2025, when it comes to Russia-Ukraine and to Israel-Gaza?
Well, let's do Russia-Ukraine first. He's going to force Volodymyr Zelensky to make peace with Vladimir Putin and to give up parts of eastern Ukraine and Crimea. I mean, I think everybody understands that. The Europeans understand that. President Zelensky understands that. Vladimir Putin certainly understands that. He wants it done and dusted. And this is not just Trump, but the key figures that surround him in the foreign policy field say, we need to get this sorted out because we don't want to be obsessively involved in European security. We want to focus our attention on China. Europe's got to look after its own affairs. And the first plank of that is we sort out Ukraine, and the only way you sort out Ukraine is by pulling American military support and forcing Zelensky to make peace. So I think that's relatively clear. On Gaza, Trump and Netanyahu have been talking all the time. They've been speaking in recent days. Before the election, they were talking, with reports that Donald Trump said to Benjamin Netanyahu, get the military action in Gaza wrapped up by the time I take over in the Oval Office, because then it's got to be all about the day after, resolving Gaza in whatever way you can, getting the hostages out, become a big problem for any occupant of that White House if there are still American citizens being held hostage by Hamas in Gaza. But for the Trump administration, it's all about the Abraham Accords. It's all about expanding them, trying to bring about the normalization in ties between Israel and Saudi that many here in Washington believe the Hamas attacks of October the 7th was designed to derail. And so they want to get that Saudi track moving. And the way they think they do that is by ending the violence in Gaza, moving to the day after, which is obviously the really complicated bit, while simultaneously using the communication channels that they opened up through the Abraham Accords to try and get back to a place where you can think about the normalization of ties between Tel Aviv and Riyadh. That's what he's going to go for. It will obviously be incredibly complicated and difficult to get there.
Simon, to wrap up, with 8 elections now under your belts, do you ever see a third party emerging in the US? It seems like the idea of a third voice just completely disappeared this time.
I thought you were going to ask me if I've got a 9th one in me.
Yeah, well, there is that as well.
To which the answer is I'm not sure. A third money machines. And one of the most amazing things about this election has been the fundraising. This has been a $10.5 billion election. Kamala Harris raised a war chest of $1 billion and was still asking for money from Americans even as the election got underway. So for a third party truly to catch fire, it's got to have big money behind it and national organizational heft. And that's why the genius, in a way, of Donald Trump was not to launch a third party. It was to take over the Republican Party and completely retool it from the inside. And that ultimately may be what some Democrats out there want to do with the Democratic Party. But to do that, you've got to say goodbye to Nancy Pelosi. She's a major cash provider through her fundraising capacities to the Democratic National Committee. The Obamas, obviously amazing fundraisers. You're going to have to take the reins of the party and then retool it, much as Donald Trump has done with the Republican Party, because launching a third party here is just so incredibly difficult. The climb is too steep.
It's frightening, isn't it? It's all about the money now.
It's absolutely all about the money, 100%.
Simon Marks, let's hope you get a ninth election in you. I'd love to come back and talk to you.
Thank you, Riz.
Cheers. Well, my next guest is the Palestinian-American political analyst Omar Badar. I wanted to get his perspective on the role of Arab-American voters during the elections, as well as the likely impact of a second Donald Trump presidency on the wars in Gaza and Lebanon. Omar, it's been a few months since we last had a chance to chat, and a lot has changed. What are your expectations in terms of U.S. foreign policy under a second Trump presidency?
You know, it's extremely unpredictable. If it's going to be anything like the first Trump presidency, we are looking at a situation of complete and total chaos in the region. Trump, the first time he came along, promised that American policy is going to be even more pro-Israel than it already was. And that meant recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, endorsing Israeli settlement expansion in the Palestinian territories, endorsing Israel's takeover of the Golan Heights in Syria, moving the embassy, and the list goes on of just letting Israel do whatever it wants and basically giving diplomatic cover to whatever Israel wanted to do. And at this point, we're right now witnessing a scale of Israeli atrocities in Gaza, in the West Bank, and in Lebanon that is really unprecedented. And Trump's promise that he's going to be even more pro-Israel right now is frankly terrifying, because it's difficult to imagine how much more pro-Israel can get compared to the Biden administration that has given Israel a carte blanche to do whatever it wants to as well.
And yet, one of his campaign promises, I will end all wars. He says he can end it in a day. That contradicts that.
Yeah, it is a complete and obvious contradiction. And it's obvious that Trump does not really care much. All of it is campaign rhetoric. And he's, frankly, himself unpredictable as well. So it's not really clear in which direction he's going to move once he actually comes into office. But there is an obvious contradiction between this idea that he's going to let Israel, quote unquote, finish the job, and also being the anti-war candidate. Those things don't go together. Israel's project is one of endless war, trying to wipe out Gaza, trying to completely ethnically cleanse the northern part of it, and now stuck in Lebanon, also in a quagmire that does not have any positive horizon on the future where you can actually end that conflict, because we're entrenched in a situation in which Israel is demanding complete and total submission from Hezbollah in Lebanon, and that is simply not going to be in the cards in the coming months.
There is that grey area of a few weeks between the actual election result and the inauguration, and it's still the Biden presidency until then. What chance is there, considering these possible contradictions, these possible twists, that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu could use this as an opportunity to scale things up until the Trump presidency's intact?
Yeah, I think we are already watching that actually unfold, where Netanyahu has escalated the violence in North Gaza in a very, very significant way, taking advantage of the fact that there's simply not going to be any major American policy interventions right now. Biden is towards the end of his presidency, and there is an anticipation of what Trump might do. And even with the uncertainty of what Trump brings with him, this is certainly the moment for Israel to try to do as much damage as possible, to try to capture as much land as possible, and to basically carry out in a fashion where the international community and the United States, particularly as the patron state that needs to sign off on whatever Israel does, is simply not going to be present in any meaningful way. So you can effectively say that Netanyahu is in charge of American foreign policy for this period, as far as the region is concerned, and is free to do whatever he wants.
Isn't there also, though, an argument that this is a window for Joe Biden to perhaps get a last-minute boost to his legacy by saying, well, you know, he's got nothing to lose by actually pushing very aggressively?
This assumes that Biden has the cognitive ability to actually do what's good for him. If he had that, he would have done policy very, very differently on Palestine and Israel for a very long time. Certainly, this would be an opportunity, but I have absolutely no confidence that Joe Biden is in any shape right now to try to think about what that legacy looks like, and the desperate moral imperative of putting a stop to this onslaught in Gaza and being on record as the person who actually put an end to it. He doesn't seem to be interested in that. And frankly, I don't think he has the mental faculty to really intervene at this point in a way that would save his legacy, in addition to the endless lives of Palestinians.
Even if he did, I presume that it's really up to Benjamin Netanyahu to concur.
Yeah,
which doesn't seem to be the case.
It's we've had all this talk constantly about Biden being upset with Netanyahu, being frustrated with Netanyahu, refusing to meet with him. But at the end of the day, as long as American military funding and diplomatic protection continues unabated, then Netanyahu has no reason to take any of these concerns seriously. They're simply just rhetoric. And right now, for Biden to actually step up to a level where he's willing to threaten U.S. military funding for Israel based on Israel's behavior just seems really implausible. But frankly, it might be the only thing that would change Israel's behavior in the meantime, apart from suffering a devastating defeat in a regional conflict that looks like it's about to spiral completely out of control as well.
I'll get onto that in a moment, but since we spoke in mid-March, things really have gotten even worse in Gaza. Could you have predicted it to reach this kind of level? And where does this leave the idea of any real ceasefire?
I don't think anybody could have seen how bad things were going to get into Gaza. I think the entire world operated on the idea that we would not witness a full-scale genocide with the world being silent and not intervening to stop it. And yet this is precisely what we have witnessed, is that we've had over a year of this, entire families being wiped out and children being starved to death. We are watching this on our TVs day in and day out. And yet the United States is ensuring that there is no intervention that would put an end to this. And yeah, it is insane that we have allowed things to reach this level. And at this point, I think there is simply no end in sight. We're finally at the point where I'm realizing, at least, that there is no red line for Israel, period, that they can actually go as far as they want to. And it's really going to be a matter of how things devolve in the region rather than the U.S. playing the role that they have always intended to play. They've always talked about playing. The U.S. as a leader of democracy and human rights and values and freedom and all of that, it's just has been utterly dismantled by U.S. embrace of the extremist and fanatical policies of the Israeli government at this point, that I don't see a prospect for a change.
And, you know, it's become even worse with Lebanon now being roped into it. And you couldn't have really predicted that at the time, or could you?
I mean, look, Lebanon, it felt inevitable. Frankly, I was one of the few people who was tweeting long before things escalated that this was inevitable. You have a setup where the only way out of that confrontation spiraling out of control would have been a ceasefire in Gaza. That is the only way that you would have put an end to it. And once it became clear that the U.S. has no interest in stepping in to achieve that ceasefire, to rein Israel in and put an end to this onslaught, then what was happening in Lebanon was absolutely inevitable. Because Hezbollah was determined that they were not going to stop what they were doing until the war on Gaza ends and until the onslaught and the genocide there comes to an end. And from Israel's perspective, they have a deterrence capacity that they're super invested in preserving. For them, the entire way that Israel can function in the region is through a relationship of regional dominance and dominance by force. So Hezbollah constantly engaging in these cross-border skirmishes was inevitable that Israel was going to overreact at some point and go all in. And right now, of course, they are stuck in a situation where they can't win. They can cause immense damage to Lebanon from the air. But in order to defeat Hezbollah, you would need to send ground troops basically into Lebanon. And that fight is not going well for Israel at all. Hezbollah is able to inflict significant damage on Israel on the ground. And we are stuck in Israel is stuck in a quagmire where, sure, Lebanon is suffering the heavier end of the devastation given Israel's aerial power. But this is also not a situation that Israel can extract itself from with any kind of victory. I think they're going to be stuck in there also for a long time, unless there is a bigger intervention from the world to put an end to this.
Well, there's often that discussion of a 3H axis, the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas. And there's also the belief, I guess, and I'd like your opinion on this, that Israel can only stretch itself so far.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely correct. They already have their hands completely full with Hezbollah. I think they thought that by decapitating the leadership and the pager attack, they've done a few things at the very beginning that were absolutely devastating to Hezbollah, but I think they underestimated the resilience of that movement, that it's bigger than a handful of leaders. Even if you decapitate the leadership, the ideological commitment of a very significant portion of Lebanon that built this drive towards fighting for Israel as a result of Israeli occupation of Lebanon in the past. They remember what that is like, and that is a very heavily motivated population that is not going to put up with a reoccupation of Lebanon or with any kind of Israeli dominance and Israel dictating to Lebanon how it's going to behave. They're going to face very, very significant resistance going into that. So the Houthis, I think, are much farther away and much weaker in a sense. They're causing trouble primarily for them in terms of access to their, southern harbor. But that, in terms of a direct military confrontation, Hezbollah is where it's at. And potentially this bigger escalation with a direct confrontation with Iran, I think, would be absolutely devastating for the region. It has really untold consequences. And that, I think, is the really worrying sign, is there doesn't seem to be enough intervention to make sure that that does not escalate out of control, because the tit for tat is ongoing, and we're all anticipating what the Iranian response is going to be in the coming days.
I want to touch briefly on the ruling of the International Court of Justice that basically Israel is heading towards. It was the way it's phrased is kind of delicate, but the word genocide came up, which caused a lot of upset for pro-Israel supporters, obviously. What were your thoughts when South Africa took that step? A very bold step.
It was an extremely bold step on the part of South Africa, and an impressive one given the fact that South Africa has nothing to gain from doing this. It's obvious that the international order is ruled by the United States for the most part, and people who are looking for their own interests would stop short of crossing certain lines. When you go after Israel with a genocide charge at the International Court of Justice, obviously that's the kind of thing that's going to shake up a significant portion of the world against you. But it was absolutely a moral imperative, and I think given their history and knowing about Israeli support for apartheid during the apartheid era in South Africa may have been part of the motivating factor. Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu and many others talked about this common struggle between South Africans and Palestinians and enduring very similar conditions. And I think that was part of why they acted with that kind of boldness. And it's a charge that frankly sticks for a simple reason. You have people like Arya Nair, who himself a Holocaust survivor, his family fled the Holocaust, started Human Rights Watch, headed the ACLU, very mainstream Jewish figure who fought for civil rights in general and for Jewish rights in particular. And he's come to the conclusion that what Israel is committing in Gaza is also a genocide. The credibility of that charge is really obvious for anybody who's not afraid to cross that line. It seems that everybody's squeamish about touching it for political reasons. But when you look at the scale of devastation in Gaza, when you look at the amount of destruction, the number of families that have been completely wiped out, and Gaza's inability to sustain life, at this point, I think this is really the only word that you can use to describe what is unfolding.
On that point, UNRWA, the UN Works and Relief Agency, is also facing the issue of now being blocked. Considering it's shifted so heavily into this humanitarian crisis, what impact do you expect from that?
Yeah, it's been absolutely devastating. I think with and without UNRWA in the short term, Israel is making it very clear that they are going to prevent Gaza from being able to sustain life in any way. They've been blocking food aid left and right, really putting the entire population of Gaza under conditions that are just unlivable. And I think that UNRWA is more about the long-term strategy of trying to end the existence of Palestinian refugees. UNRWA is the reason why Palestinian refugees can survive, can actually live day by day, awaiting the right to return to their homes and to be able to go back to the homes that they have actually come from. And Israel is interested in dismantling they're interested in dismantling the entire Palestinian national movement for freedom. And part of that is going to be chipping down at UNRWA and the ability of Palestinian refugees to survive as well.
As we kind of wrap up, a couple of quick thoughts. Where did it go wrong as far as Arab American voters in the US election?
Arab American voters understand what a threat Trump poses, but they could not bring themselves to vote for a Democratic administration that has enabled genocide for an entire year and would not even say anything about being serious about putting an end to it. And that has really shifted things in a way that is, and what's also equally impressive about it is how savvy Trump was, that he went to Michigan selling himself as the pro-peace candidate, poking fun at the Democrats, at his opponent for campaigning with Liz Cheney and talking about how the Cheneys want to destroy the Middle East and invade every Arab and Muslim country and so on. It was a level of political savviness on the Trump administration. It is frankly shocking and shameful that the Democrats did not see what an opportunity they were wasting in taking a politically smart choice that is also morally a moral imperative to oppose genocide and to gain politically from it. Instead, they chose to be on the wrong side of history and pay a very dear political price for it domestically as well.
Last thought then, you alluded to this, the risk of a wider conflict in the Middle East.
I think what Trump does when he comes in is going to very quickly tell us which direction things are heading, but that is absolutely a very, very real and serious prospect. Both Iran and Israel are committed to escalation right now. Neither of them is willing to basically bow their head down and accept the other country's dominance. And that is on a trajectory where it's going to inevitably lead to a very, very major confrontation that could pull the United States in also directly. And the question is, does the U.S. have that appetite? Because if the U.S. is committed to not engaging directly, then they would absolutely have to put an end to the way Israel is behaving in the region. This rampage that Netanyahu has gone on for an entire year has to come to an end. And if President Trump does not actually put an end to it, then it seems like it is actually inevitable. And we are looking for, at a scale of a regional conflagration, that could not figuratively, but literally kill millions of people in the region. We are talking about a war that, with just the rocket arsenal that Iran has, the regional allies that they have, you're talking about the entire region being set ablaze, and it's a very, very dangerous situation.
Omar, we'll speak again, I'm sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now let's get more on the political post-mortem with Matt Gaetz. He was the main foreign policy advisor to Democratic Senator Bernie Sanders. He's now Executive Vice President at the Center for International Policy. Matt Gaetz, thanks very much. I guess the first question is, where did the Democrats go wrong?
Well, I think there's an anti-incumbent mood both here and around the world. This has been a year with a lot of elections in democratic countries, and incumbents have not done well. There's a general mood of just dissatisfaction and kind of questioning and a lot of hostility toward, the system or the establishment. And I think that's what we saw here. That's not to say that these concerns and this anger is not legitimate. I think it is. I think despite the fact that a lot of the economic indicators show that the American economy is in pretty good shape, a lot of people just aren't feeling that in their lives. The cost of living, the cost of basic goods, groceries, the cost of housing, these are rising. And clearly, American voters punish the Democrats for that.
For many years, Bernie Sanders was seen as the voice of reason for those who couldn't find, equity with either side of the Republicans or Democrats. I guess those guys are now saying we should have listened to Bernie Sanders.
Well, I mean, for the longest time, he was not seen as the voice of reason. But after, I think, 2016, yes, as you said, I mean, it became clear that someone who was himself a critic of the system and of the establishment was making a lot of the same arguments. I don't want to compare him to Trump too much, but both of them had an anti-establishment critique. I think Bernie's was obviously more unifying, I think more positive and constructive. And yes, I think in the wake of this week's defeat for Democrats, I think a lot of people are saying Bernie is onto something. So I think the question is, will the party leadership have the wisdom to really rethink, to understand what they got wrong, and really embrace that more kind of populist economic message that I think Bernie and his movement and others in the kind of populist left of the Democratic Party have been pushing?
There's also going to be the issue of winning back the lost voters. It surprised a lot of people. We had Arab American voters going one way, Black American voters, Latino American voters. There seemed to be a massive focus on these different groups and how it all shifted.
Right. No, I think that's right. I mean, we talk about Arab American voters, and we cannot not talk about Gaza. But I think that's not just an Arab American issue. I think there are a lot of Americans, particularly young Americans, including Black Americans and others, for whom Gaza is bigger than just a foreign policy issue. The issue of Palestinian rights has become part of the kind of broader progressive social justice and racial justice agenda. But I think it's also in many ways a referendum on how America behaves in the world. You have a lot of Americans who have real questions about how America has operated American foreign policy over the past several decades. Obviously, the Iraq War was a huge turning point for a lot of people, but still to watch the United States for now over a year backing almost completely unconditionally this massacre, the killing of tens of thousands of people, the displacement of over almost 2 million, that is hard for a lot of people to take. And I think the idea that we were ever going to get people to kind of disassociate these things, I think was a fantasy. And again, this goes to whether the question now is whether the Democratic Party leadership is capable of really kind of assimilating these lessons.
Now, of course, Donald Trump will position it that he's won over all these voters. But to what degree was the Arab American pro-Trump vote really a backlash, simply an anti-Biden vote or anti-Biden administration vote?
I think it certainly was to some extent. I think it's also worth noting, I think a lot in the Arab American community, which in this country is largely Christian rather than Muslim, although we do have a growing Muslim population. I mean, Trump brought a social conservative message. I mean, he spoke to social and religiously conservative audiences in the Arab American community and in the Latino community. Obviously, the evangelical community is very strongly pro-Trump, so I think that's a part of it as well.
So many nations around the world have had women leaders. To what degree was this a major setback for the idea of a woman U.S. president?
Yeah, I don't want to ever underestimate the element of sexism and misogyny that still certainly exists in our society. But I also don't want to overinterpret it that way. I think had Kamala Harris had a better message, had she done more work to kind of articulate a policy vision, and frankly had more time to run as the actual candidate, I think she was handicapped by both the kind of short amount of time she had to kind of get her campaign going, also the fact that she is the sitting vice president. So it was a little bit tough for her to distinguish herself from the president with whom she was still working. So I think all of those things hindered her as well.
Does she have a chance to re-enter the race at some point in the future?
I think it's probably unlikely. I think it's very rare, certainly in modern times, to see a candidate who ran and lost to come back. But I would not count it out completely, but I think it's very unlikely.
Matt, how did America become so divided?
It's been a long time coming, but I think there's a lot of reasons for it. I think growing inequality. I think the fact that a lot of Americans are struggling, they see others doing much better. They feel that the system is unfair. They see privileges and wealth accruing to a very small elite. They've become cynical about the ability of government and of basic politics to deliver policy change that impacts them. And amid that frustration, and this is historically true, people will become more susceptible to demagogues who offer them a place to point that anger, people to blame, whether it's immigrants, whether it's minorities, whether it's foreign enemies. We can go back to times throughout history where we've seen this repeatedly happening. So that's why I think it's going to be very important for Democrats to offer a better vision of how we are actually the party that can help make your lives better in a way that does not simply displace that anger onto disfavored minorities.
To some degree, this level of polarization in America, it seems unprecedented, and it doesn't feel like it could be something that's healed that quickly. Is this something now going to be generational, this divide, or could this message of unity that the candidates kept putting out actually be achieved?
Right. Well, historically, we were pretty polarized. It led to the Civil War. I hope it will not lead to that again. I hope there will be a way for us to kind of reconstruct a shared concept of the American political project, because that's where we're at right now. We have, a really closely divided country and who have, two sides that have quite different visions of what it means to be an American, what America is for, who is really an American and who is not. And I think the work, so I would agree, it is probably generational, to do the work, to kind of reach across and talk to people with whom we disagree, people with whom, who have ideas that we might find offensive, and yet with whom we share this country. But that is the task ahead of us.
I think this election, certainly for an international audience, brought up the term swing states more than ever. And I think it surprises people that there can be such a geographical division within the U.S.
Yeah, and I have to apologize to colleagues around the world who are required to pay such close attention to our elections and our swing states and our bizarre electoral college, because it does impact them. Again, this is something I think it's important for Americans to keep in mind. This election, the outcome of our elections, impacts people around the world who have no say in those elections. And so yeah, I think there are several battleground states. Trump won most, if not all of them. But I think it's because there are, both sides have their own electoral map, their, so-called path to victory. And clearly Trump's path was the better one this time.
John Bolton, who was the former U.S. ambassador to the UN and then became Donald Trump's national security advisor, and then fell out with him very badly, commented that his worry was a second Donald Trump presidency would allow Donald Trump, having realized what he could and couldn't do in the first one, to have much more power and much more focus on what he would do this time. What changes do you expect with the second Trump presidency?
Yeah, well, I think, I don't agree with John Bolton on a lot, but I do think he's right. I think Trump, in the 4 years of his first administration, Trump learned that you need to have people who are loyal to you. You need to have people who are willing to execute what you want. And I think he's done some work over these past years, clearly, to assemble a crew and a team that is more likely to do that. I mean, I think there are, in certain areas of the world, it depends what we're talking about. I think he will continue the work of the first administration. But what's interesting about this is in a lot of areas, the Biden administration continued the work, or at least the direction of the Trump administration, starting with the focus on China, which has been the driving kind of imperative of American foreign policy, beginning with Trump. Biden has picked that up, but I think he stayed on the right side rhetorically, being careful not to, demonize Chinese or Asian Americans in a way that Trump certainly did. In the Middle East as well, too. I mean, with a few exceptions, Biden essentially carried forward what Trump was trying to do in the Middle East. And again, a lot of it driven by China, but the embrace of the Abraham Accords, seeing this as a kind of workable security and stability arrangement for the region, despite the cost and repression for the region's people. And the last thing I would say is, part of what 2016 showed us, and this is where I go back to what Bernie Sanders brought as well, was this sense that so many Americans, this system is not working for them. Our economic system, our trade system, our foreign policy. And so I think, what we did see from Biden, and this is one of the most important things, was the kind of move away from the old neoliberal kind of corporate-led global trade order. And I think there were very important steps taken to kind of try and define a new economic order that invests in American jobs, tries to rebuild American industry. But it's very easy to see how that could kind of evolve very quickly into kind of a new, trade blocks, trade war. And that is what we're going to likely see from Trump.
Now, one thing, the BRICS, or BRICS plus nations, as they've come up to be now, are a growing strength, growing strong bloc. It sounds like Donald Trump is willing to poke the bear, so to speak, in creating greater division, especially with China and perhaps with India even. What is this going to do to America's position on the world stage, particularly with trade?
Yeah. I mean, first off, I think, yes, we are already farther into a multipolar era than I think many people in Washington would like to admit. The United States, obviously, still enormously powerful, still has a set of partnerships and alliances that are really unmatched, yet our relative share of power is diminishing. Relative to China, relative to some of the countries, the BRICS countries that you mentioned. And I think Donald Trump has an inherent suspicion of multilateralism. We saw this goes back to his understanding of how you do business deals. He prefers kind of bilateral business deals, just like me and you sit down and we work this out. So I think that is going to kind of undergird his attempt to kind of stoke divisions, not only in kind of alliances of adversaries, but also within alliances of allies as well.
Well, the two key factors, I guess, that could position America in the new era, apart from trade, is conflicts. And it seems that America might end up in a very difficult position when it comes to blocs taking sides, when it comes to Israel, Gaza, and also Ukraine, Russia. Can Donald Trump stop conflicts in a day, as he promises?
Right. I mean, I think, Donald Trump, I think he's shown a willingness, he uses this kind of recklessness and kind of unpredictability. And again, it looks very different when you're doing it as a real estate mogul versus president of the United States. But unfortunately, he seems to take the same approach regardless. But we did see, in his first term, that even though I think his approach led us to the brink of conflict several times, like particularly with North Korea and then later with Iran, when he's faced with the possibility of really open conflict, he has stepped back. So I think there is something in his understanding that even though he's going to use the idea of conflict to try and get a better deal, he may act rationally in that moment. Now, I think we got lucky in both of those cases. We may not get lucky again, and I think that's what's very concerning. Because once you go down this path, once violence really starts to erupt, it can spiral very quickly.
What do you expect his relationship under a second presidency to be with NATO?
Yeah. I mean, I would not expect him to withdraw from NATO at the outset, but I do think he's made his views on NATO clear, and that he feels that we are getting taken for a ride. I mean, we're getting ripped off is kind of Trump's kind of general argument, and that has a lot of appeal to Americans who have questions about, the role that America has played as a sort of global security guarantor. Are we getting a benefit in comparison to how much we are paying for other security? Now, I think there is a good argument that Americans have benefited enormously from this arrangement. But Trump, particularly with NATO, the way he talks about it, I mean, I still don't know if he understands how NATO works. He seems to think that European allies pay up to us instead of like paying into their own defense. But I think, and I expect if they didn't start to get their act together the first time, I would hope the Europeans have gotten the message now that they do need to start to think a lot more seriously about looking to their own defense. Because as I said, I don't think Trump's going to pull out of NATO immediately, but I think he's definitely going to be making noise about this. And I'll be interested to see how our European allies respond.
On the issue of the climate and climate change, he seems to be a climate change denier to many and pushing, obviously, the fossil fuel agenda. I wonder how that will affect his relationship with countries like the Middle East, which, if anything, are trying to transition away from it.
Yeah, it's a problem. I mean, for Trump, it seems very basic. He just thinks that, renewable energy and believing in climate change is bad for business. That's what it comes down to him, for him. And I think, the way that Biden has approached it, when he's, the way he says, when I hear climate change, I think green jobs, I think more jobs. That's the better way to approach it. But yeah, I think as we saw in the first term when Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, I think unfortunately we're going to see a rollback of a lot of these really important steps that were taken under the Biden administration to really starting investing in renewable energy and make a transition.
A final thought. One of my guests on my show said one of the issues that Donald Trump, one of the issues with Donald Trump is that he thinks of himself as a president, as ruler of America, not as someone who serves American citizens, as an elected leader. Is that likely, that agenda, being the ruler of America, likely to really play in?
I think so. I mean, clearly, this is, you see this in the way he is very clearly kind of admiring of more powerful dictators, whether it's Putin, whether it's Xi, leaders of other countries who have a lot more, authority to act as they want and have, populations under their control. He feels that, he felt that the first time. Now that he's been reelected, he will certainly feel it even more so. So I think we're going to see that reflected in the way he governs.
Especially with the House on his side now and changing the justice system.
That's right. This is going to be Trump unleashed.
Matt Gaetz, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's all for this special edition of the show, coming to you from Washington, D.C. From me and the team, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday right here on Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, Donald Trump's choice for Attorney General, Matt Gaetz, is already being called the most controversial nomination so far, and that comes from both sides of the aisle. As the new administration starts to take shape, the Republicans can look forward to a firm grip on power and control of both chambers of Congress. After a heated back and forth of insults, President-elect Trump and President Biden shake hands at the White House, vowing a smooth transition of power. And a damning report is published by Human Rights Watch about the war in Gaza. That report accuses Israel of ethnic cleansing and the forcible transfer of civilians in the Palestinian enclave. Now, President-elect Donald Trump has tapped the Florida politician Matt Gaetz to lead his U.S. Department of Justice. That's a man who once called abortion activists ugly and overweight. Well, as Trump looks to fill his cabinet, Gaetz has been called the most controversial nomination by far. While this pick shocked many, analysts say it sends a clear message. Trump, in this second term, is determined to staff his administration with hawkish loyalists he can trust. So let's take a closer look at Matt Gaetz, Donald Trump's pick for Attorney General.
Biden and Trump should have been treated equally. They weren't, and that is the double standard that I think a lot of Americans are concerned about.
President Trump had vision, focus. He showed empathy regarding the struggles of Americans under Joe Biden's policy.
January 6th last year wasn't an insurrection. No one's been charged with insurrection.
So let's find out more about Matt Gaetz, and we can speak to Angie Wong, a Florida Republican executive who joins us now from Miami. Angie, great to have you back with us here on Al Arabiya News. Matt Gaetz, nominated as Attorney General. Do you know him, and what are your thoughts about this appointment?
Yeah, I think the whole political world is up on fire over this appointment. It is a really odd nomination, I think, coming from both sides. I think the left has already solidified that they're going to be a hard no on Matt Gaetz, whereas the right, I mean, I've been talking to political strategists and also congressional members for the last 12 hours or so since this nomination came around. Everyone's scratching their heads because Matt Gaetz is not, what I'm hearing is that he's not very qualified for this job. And to run the DOJ, well, you kind of need to have some trial lawyer experience, some policy experience. And, a lot of people were even shocked to learn that Matt Gaetz is, in fact, a lawyer. So it was a big shock to my world yesterday, and not all favorable. Even President Trump has come out to say that if Matt Gaetz can last, can survive until January's Senate confirmation, then he can get the job. So I think even the president is kind of weary as to what's happened. But there's a lot of political inside play here with this particular appointment. Remember, it was just hours after the announcement of Matt Gaetz coming in as AG, Attorney General, that he resigned from his congressional seat. A lot of people think that has a lot to do with the fact that the congressional calendar was just recently released. And that is when all the hearings take place in Congress, including one that Matt Gaetz was involved in. And this was an ethics committee investigation into Matt Gaetz and, unfortunately, underage girls. And that was brought on, I think, a few months ago. But finally, there was going to be a public hearing about it this Friday. So a lot of people are speculating that that had a lot to do with his resignation from the 118th Congress.
Yeah, I mean, you're painting a picture of someone here, which is sort of what we've managed to garner from looking at the newspapers and listening to commentators. No shortage of enemies, it appears, even from within the GOP. The Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski saying, I don't think this is a serious nomination for Attorney General. Then we've had the Republican Max Miller saying this appointment is silly and saying that Gaetz will never get confirmed by the Senate. It sounds like this is... And what you're saying as well makes this sound like it's quite a widely held opinion.
It is. There's just no clear pathway except for one, for Matt Gaetz to actually be appointed as Attorney General. And that is if President Trump, along with House Speaker Mike Johnson, exercises the recess appointments. The recess appointments is when both houses go into recess, and therefore creating a crisis for the president to step in and appoint cabinet members without congressional approval. And that has been spoken about as one theory that could get Matt Gaetz in, because if you were to do the traditional pathway of getting Senate confirmations, therefore going through a Senate hearing, it's very likely that it's going to be a dead-on arrival scenario for Matt Gaetz. Mainly because we already have, I'm hearing up to 7 senators who are saying hard no on Matt Gaetz, and therefore the math already fails.
Okay, so I mean, it sounds like this is another case of Donald Trump being a disruptor, tearing up the rule book. It sounds like he doesn't think this is actually going to happen. I mean, what's the strategy here?
Well, and that's where I'm scratching my head. Why would President Trump, along with his very smart advisors, even put themselves in a situation where there's such a wild card where they know that the pathway for Matt Gaetz to get in as Attorney General is very, very slim. And even going so far as to exercise presidential powers that has never been tested before, like the recess appointments, to get one cabinet member in, it doesn't make any sense. On top of that, Matt Gaetz has pretty much no experience in this realm. I mean, there are way better candidates, such as AG Ken Paxton, for example, of Texas, who's been also a Trump loyalist and also someone that was shortlisted for this role. There's a lot of qualified people. At the end of the day, you need someone who understands legal strategy and can run the DOJ. Given what the rumors of Matt Gaetz is and how much, I'm sorry, but he's quite hated within Washington and other circles, it's like giving the mob boss keys to justice. So that's why, there's been so much backlash. Now, the good that's come of this is that all of Trump's other nominees, well, they're not being scrutinized as much, right? Because all the focus has been scrutinized to Matt Gaetz and all the media attention has been put on him. I know there's a double play here. I smell it already. The fact that Matt Gaetz walked away from his congressional seat in Florida 1 and leaving it to a special election that happens in about 60 days, that in itself is a major, major defeat for him because he didn't have to resign from his seat in order to be the nominee for Attorney General. So some of it doesn't make sense, but I'm sure we'll find out what's happening in the days to come.
Yeah, but what about the argument that if you're going to shake up the Department of Justice, you need a wrecking ball? He's a wrecking ball, isn't he?
He is. There are plenty of wrecking balls and controllable wrecking balls that Trump has in his corner, ones that can actually get Senate approval, right? So there are easier players to bring on, players that make sense to bring on. As far as Matt Gaetz, it does feel a little bit to me like an IOU. There is something else going on, a lot of Florida politics being played on this one. And ultimately, I heard a theory this morning from a political GOP strategist that it could very well be that when it comes to Senate confirmations, the first one hardly ever gets in. And maybe because he's such a wild card and almost so extreme that, it causes such a visceral reaction among senators that they might reject the first one, but then take a milder version of a wrecking ball for the second nominee. So that could be in play as well.
And what are we hearing from senators in this regard? I mean, what do you think their fears are at this stage?
There's several things. You already have several senators who have already come out with hard nose, such as Susan Collins of Maine. She came out right away and said, no, that's not one for me. And at the moment, I'm hearing anywhere from 5 to 7 hard nose from the Senate in the early days of this. Now, remember, Matt Gaetz still has about 70 days to romance them before, there is any type of hearing on his confirmation. But I'm hearing that this is dead on arrival. I'm hearing that this is something that Trump threw in for entertainment values. I'm hearing that there's just, I think it was Max Miller who said that, there's a greater chance of Matt Gaetz having tea with Queen Elizabeth II than it would be for him to get Senate approval. So all of this could just be entertainment. It could just be laying the groundwork for Matt Gaetz to run for Florida governor, which that race is going to kick off next year. It could just be a brand ID exercise for Matt Gaetz. We don't really know, but what we do know is that the pathway for Matt Gaetz to actually get in as Attorney General is slimmer and slimmer. What I don't like is, people like Elon Musk threatening Republicans that if you don't back everything that Trump says and does, that he's going to finance a primary challenger in the next rounds. I don't like that particular type of bullying. I think that if you are good for the job, you have to pass through the checks and balances of our Constitution here in the U.S. to get that position. And you have to, answer some questions and be right for the role. So people like Elon Musk, who has become a very significant player here in the U.S. politics, along with podcaster Tim Pool, well, they're making threats to Republicans saying, if you don't fall into line, we're going to come after you. That's not necessarily the right approach. That's something I see Democrats doing. I don't like it when we play dirty like that.
Sure, and you touched on something earlier I wanted to pick up on as well, which is that this appointment of Matt Gaetz has rather overshadowed some of the other appointments. And, take Senator Marco Rubio, for example, who's nominated for Secretary of State yesterday. When there was a press conference, journalists seemed far more interested in the Matt Gaetz appointment than they were in Marco Rubio's appointment. And that can't be very welcome as a development for someone like Marco Rubio, is it?
It is and it's not. I mean, if I were Marco Rubio's comms person, I'm actually quite grateful for the distraction, because what happens is if all the attention is put onto another figure, then you kind of sail through a lot of the dirty stuff that happens when you become nominated, right? There's a lot of dirt that comes out. All of a sudden, a lot of opposition research comes out, because you're now, right about to take a very, very top seat within the administration. So I think for Marco Rubio, he's such a seasoned politician, and he has the resume to be Secretary of State. I think this is actually a good thing for him to not be in the spotlight, to land that seat, secure it, and do his job. I think that is great without all the extra distractions of the media.
I mean, we talk a lot about positions in the United States government and how the whole system works, and we sometimes forget that not everyone talks about this all the time like we do. Just remind us why the role of Attorney General is such an important role.
Right. So, I mean, this is the top law enforcement in the United States, given that we've just gone through 4+ years of lawfare with Donald Trump and his family members and his allies. I think Donald Trump is looking for some protection here, mainly to get all these legal cases off his back, which, clearly, he won a trifecta last week with the White House, the House of Congress, as well as the Senate, as well as the popular vote. So he's doing his victory lap, but the only thing that's creating speed bumps for him on his road to the presidency in the White House are these legal cases that still linger. Remember, on November 26th, just in a few weeks' time, he's about to go into a sentencing hearing about his Manhattan DA case. So that's still there. And there's still a lot of these things lingering about, especially with other picks and senior advisors from his new administration. So he wants someone who's going to be able to remove all those obstacles, have Trump and his family's backs, but also understand the political landscape. It's a very, very political role, even though it should be a legal role. This is something that, again, it's a top law enforcement. I think a lot of fears from the Matt Gaetz appointment is that he is known to be a trickster. He is known to play around, and he may use the DOJ to go after his own enemies. Remember, he has a case currently, for himself and also people that he surrounds himself with, that those cases, those criminal investigations would go away if he became the top law enforcement. So there's a lot of stuff there that, again, I'm not the senator, but I imagine those are some of the questions that Matt Gaetz will have to answer if he were to get a Senate hearing.
Okay, and just more broadly, looking at how Team Trump is shaping up, what are your thoughts, and what sort of a pattern do you think we're starting to see in terms of the appointments and the profile of people that Donald Trump is selecting?
No, I think they're fantastic. I know some of them don't make sense to the audience because they're just so radical. Look, he's formed the A-list. He's formed the A-team of politics here. A lot of them are showmen, and that's good too. They've shown their loyalty to President Trump. I had heard from the transition team, the #1 requirement to work in the new Trump administration is that you cannot come from a lobbyist background. And I think that's why the Secretary of Defense and a lot of kind of the national security roles, those were quite surprising, but it's because a lot of them are Washington outsiders. They do not have the IOUs coming in from the military complex, industrial complex. They are not seeking jobs, with Boeing and others after the administration. They're not tied to the corporatists. So I think that is why they were chosen, is because they come in almost clean. And in order to do so, well, it's hard to work in Washington and come in clean at all. So that's why he has these new faces as nominees.
And just lastly, Angie, I mean, looking forward to the second term in office for Donald Trump, some saying it's looking like it's going to be a bit more organised than the first term, but perhaps a little bit more confrontational. Do you think that's an accurate assessment?
Well, look, what I had also heard from the Trump team is that they realize they have a very short period of time to get through their entire agenda. And they're going to push through on day one as much as they can, because they understand there are hawks lurking behind them. Any sort of trip up, any sort of failure, they're going to jump in on and create a big media mess or other messes. So they realize that they have to get pushed through their agenda as soon as they can. And I think that's the right move, actually, because with Trump, there's always trouble behind him somewhere, just waiting to explode. So hopefully we can get as much as we can done in the first few weeks, if not months, of the administration before it starts raining again. I think the appointments are good. I think they're solid. It's a young energy, right? And it's not a Washingtonian energy. I think most people that he's appointed has more background in business and international relations and other sectors rather than just being career politicians. I think that's a really good thing for Americans. I see processes and I see operational and I see just milestones being met. Whereas, the Washington, D.C. clog happens with every administration. I don't see it with this team.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you so much, Florida Republican Executive Angie Wong. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
So, first the presidency, then the Senate, and now the House. Projections show the Republicans dominating right across the so-called trifecta. Well, the latest win for Trump's party means that they would now have full control of the government. Well, it is expected to give the president-elect more freedom to get his policies through the system, reminiscent of when Donald Trump achieved a similar victory in his first term. So what does all of this mean for America, and what happens to the system of checks and balances now that the Republicans are slated to have a majority in the government? Well, to tell us more, we're joined by Scott Lucas, a political analyst and professor of American Studies at the Clinton Institute at University College Dublin. Professor, thank you very much indeed for being with us. It's been 9 days since Election Day, feels like a lot longer. The US bicameral system is, of course, quite complicated. Just help our viewers and me to understand where we are in terms of the results and who is going to be in control of Congress.
So the American system has three branches. It has the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court, where you have a conservative majority, the executive branch, where the incoming president will be Donald Trump in January, and then it has the legislative branch, which is made up of two houses. You have the upper chamber, which is the Senate, where the Republicans have a more comfortable than expected majority, 53 or 54 out of the 100 seats. And then you have the House, where the Republicans are going to have a razor-thin majority. And I need to emphasize that word razor-thin majority because it means that while the Republicans do have control of the presidency and Congress, that thin majority means that you may not see the Trump administration being able to push legislation through, because if only one or two members of their party defect in the House, and the Republicans are not just a single party, there are divisions within that party, then the Trump votes would be checked in trying to sort of bulldoze Congress.
Okay, so basically with the governing trifecta, the president's party controls both chambers of Congress. It means that basically they can do more or less what they want to do. Things will be a lot easier for the Republicans come January, won't it?
I think there's two things I need to add that I'm afraid sort of complicate this. The first is that the Trump people don't actually really govern with legislation. They didn't do that in the first term in the White House. The only significant piece of legislation, even though they had a majority in both houses of Congress, was the big tax cut bill in December 2017. The Trump people prefer to rule more through executive orders. But secondly, I have to come back to that. In theory, you're right. You know, if the Republicans have both the Senate and the House, then they have a majority on every piece of legislation. But because that House majority may be 3, 4, 5 seats, if only 2 Republicans defect, if they oppose a piece of legislation, then it fails. So the Republicans still have to maintain party unity to try to get their agenda across, even though they do have this headline victory across the president's seat and across the Senate and House.
Okay, so they can more or less do what they want, but not entirely unhindered is what you're saying. And I just wonder what your forecasts are for how the GOP is going to use this control of Congress.
I think the significant thing, which is unprecedented in U.S. history, is that you have a party within a party. You have the Republican Party, which we've had going on for about 165 years. But you have a Trumpist group, which is trying to take control of the party. You'll notice that in the House of Representatives, the loudest Republicans are those who are Trump supporters. Now, that means that they have an advantage in trying to push through Trump's legislation. But if other Republicans aren't happy with it, if they aren't happy with Trump's approach, then that party split could hinder them. And I think this is very important because there's a wider context here. Donald Trump is not just trying to pass legislation. He's waging war on the U.S. system. He's trying to break the Justice Department. He's trying to break the Treasury. He's trying to break the military to make them loyal to him. And it's one thing for Republicans to say, oh, we'll support Trump on this piece of legislation. Will they support him if he tries to curb the powers of Congress? We have a phrase here in Ireland, which is, will the turkey vote for Christmas? Will the Republicans in Congress vote for legislation that may curb their powers and ultimately hinder the party?
Okay, we're going to talk a bit more about checks and balances in just a moment, but I'd like to just carry on talking about policy, if you don't mind, in particular in the first 100 days of the Trump administration, and how you see things unfolding in terms of the Trump administration's agenda. I mean, what are we expecting? Some tax cuts, that famous deportation legislation, a repeal perhaps of Obamacare? What would be your forecast?
So I think on the economic front, what we watch for is a reduction in corporation tax. Trump has talked about reducing the rate to 15%. If companies come back to the U.S., that is not as unsettling as his other big economic thought bubble, which is to slap a tariff on everybody in the world, 10, 15, maybe 20%, as well as specific tariffs, 60, 80, 100% on China. Those, I think, would be quite destabilizing wherever you are, whether you're in the U.S., whether you're in Europe, whether you're in the Gulf. I think you'll see executive orders, not legislation, executive orders to deregulate energy markets, to make it easier to drill for oil. That will have an effect on the price of oil. So it'll have an effect on the Gulf in terms of how they react to that U.S. change in policy. I think in terms of immigration, we have the threat that the Trump administration could start deporting a lot of people. They're even talking about millions of people. That would be a very costly move. It is estimated to cost $88 billion to deport 1 million people, and it would wreck the country. It would cause unprecedented division and turmoil. And in terms of foreign policy, what I'm watching out for is whether Trump cuts support for Ukraine against the Russian invasion, making that country very vulnerable and at risk of being conquered, and whether Trump is going to give unlimited support, no checks whatsoever on the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, over his war in Gaza and his war in Lebanon.
So from what you're saying, it sounds like it's not necessarily just Donald Trump's opponents who should be worried here.
No, I mean, Donald Trump's opponents are going to have to watch out because he has threatened vengeance against them. And that will come not as much through legislation, it'll come through executive decrees and trying to take control of U.S. agencies. But America no longer has allies in the sense that we have been used to it since 1945. Allies in Europe are more likely to be insulted and opposed by Trump than, for example, someone like Vladimir Putin in Russia, who Trump admires. Allies in Asia are more likely to be insulted, like South Korea and Japan, than, say, China's Xi Jinping, who Trump has called president for life, or North Korea's Kim Jong-un, and allies in the Gulf. They can't count on Trump being a consistent president. What you'll probably see Gulf states do is they'll try to flatter Trump. They'll try to invite him to their countries. They'll give him big ceremonies. In other words, this will be a transactional politics, make Trump look good, rather than a politics of alliance between systems, which has been the normal rules of the game before Donald Trump came to power.
Just looking back to the control of the House and the Senate, I mean, in the old days, single-party control of Congress used to be more common than it is today. Why do you think in the last couple of decades it's become more of a rarity?
I think that's because America is on a pendulum now, partly because of the social media environment, which is so divisive, partly because the language of politics is so divisive. That idea of consensus, that you work with each other, that's kind of gone. So what you saw in 2016 is you saw the party swing very hard towards Trump. But then 2 years later, in what we call the midterm elections, it swung back to the Democrats in terms of the congressional votes. 2020, we saw the presidency swing to the Democrats. 2022, the Republicans gained some ground back. So what we're likely to see here is that while we'll talk now about a Republican trifecta controlling Congress and the presidency in 2025, that I suspect by the 2026 elections for Congress, the Democrats will regain ground. And in fact, I think the Democrats have a good chance of retaking control of at least the House in those 2026 elections.
Yeah, that's the amazing thing about US politics, which is that you're never really more than 24 months away from a really consequential election. And what you're saying is that this trifecta control could ultimately turn out to be quite short-lived for this Trump administration.
No, I think it will be, because the two core issues that I think decided this last election were what Americans felt about the economy and what they felt about immigration. And the reason why Trump won was not because he put forth proposals on the economy and immigration, but because he put out this scary misinformation about the U.S. economy, which isn't doing as badly as Trump said, and about immigration, where it's a complete falsehood that America is being overrun by terrorists and criminals. Americans are going to expect Trump to deliver economic progress. They're going to expect him to do something which is just not like a wall with Mexico, some gimmick like that, but to do something about immigration which is constructive. And Trump's not that kind of president. Trump isn't the type of president who is very organized, very coherent in how he approaches issues. So I think his sound bites blaming the other side, that works when he's in opposition, but I don't think it's going to work when he's in power. I don't think he's going to be able to deliver on those issues, and that's where the Democrats will have their opportunity.
And of course, he and his administration have got less than 2 years to start thinking ahead to those midterms, and the Democrats as well. I mean, when do people in the United States generally move on from the presidential election and start thinking about how they're going to win the midterms? When does that happen in the sort of the political cycle?
I think as early as next spring, you're already going to have people looking ahead to 2026. I mean, that's partly because it takes such money now to run, even if you're running for the lower house. It takes a lot more money to run for the Senate. And it's also because the stakes are higher in America. And that, we're probably at the most critical time in American history since 1865. So I think already in the spring, while we're looking at what could be very damaging approach by Trump, I mean, he could cause real damage to the U.S. system. People will already be thinking, okay, we've got 15, 18 months to organize, either to support Trump, to keep on doing what he's doing, or to really try to defend the U.S. system and try to get some type of control back into Congress.
And the Democrats will presumably, as of about January, start doing some fairly serious post-mortem studies on the election and trying to work out where everything went so wrong for them and why they were so unprepared for the outcome, which was totally the opposite of what they had expected and what the pollsters had expected. I mean, where do you think, in this early stage of reflection, it's only been just over a week, but where do you think it went so badly wrong for them?
I've just written a big article on this for the Journal here in Ireland, which is that post-mortem started the day after the election. And it's been fascinating in that a lot of the knee-jerk reaction among analysts is that Democrats shouldn't have talked so much about rights. They shouldn't have talked about women's rights, that they shouldn't have talked about LGBT rights. They shouldn't have talked about rights for minorities. They shouldn't have been woke, that meaningless phrase. The critique is that because the Democrats did that, they weren't paying attention to the economy, to immigration. I think there's an easy answer here, and that is you need a party which is both going to reassure Americans that it is competent over the economy, competent over immigration, and a party that defends rights as well. I think reproductive rights continues to be one of the leading issues in the United States. If you have a party that can do both of those things, you're going to be in pretty good stead. I think the easiest parallel I've got for you in terms of the pre-social media era, in 1992, the Democratic Party faced a real serious challenge. It had been 12 years out of power. The outcome of that was Bill Clinton, a centrist who could rally the Democrats. In 2008, the Democrats had lost 2 straight elections to the Republicans. The outcome of a very open debate led to this unprecedented breakthrough of a Black American, Barack Obama, becoming president. So as gloomy as it looks for the Democrats right now, provided Trump doesn't bring the entire system down, there is hope that they can realign in good shape for the next midterm elections and definitely for the next presidential election in 2028.
All right. Professor Scott Lucas, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time today.
Thank you.
So, with Donald Trump preparing to retake the White House following his landslide election win, the sitting US President Joe Biden has facilitated an official transition meeting. Well, months of sniping seemed to come to an end as the two leaders sat in front of a fire in the Oval Office. They shook hands in a scene exhibiting peace and order. Well, Donald Trump even went as far as saying that he appreciated this, quote, smooth transition.
Politics is tough, and it's, in many cases, not a very nice world, but it is a nice world today, and I appreciate very much a transition that's so smooth. It'll be as smooth as it can get, and I very much appreciate that, Jim.
You're welcome. Well, that calm and seemingly friendly scene between Donald Trump and Joe Biden has prompted discussion online, focusing on Biden's joyful demeanor and inspiring creative AI videos like this one, which has been shared widely on X. A bit of humour there. Well, of course, in contrast and straying away from tradition, Donald Trump did not offer Joe Biden that same kind of transition meeting back in 2020. He even declined to concede the election results. So what do we read into this apparent change of tune? Well, we can speak now to David Kusnett, former White House Director of Speechwriting to President Bill Clinton. Great to have you back with us once again on Al Arabiya News. That meeting was described yesterday as having been, quote, very cordial, very gracious and substantive. A stark contrast, isn't it, to what happened in 2020?
Well, it is a stark contrast. As President Biden has said, you can't love America only when you win. President Biden has shown that he is willing to respect the traditions of American politics when he wins and also when his party has lost. And unfortunately, we've only seen President-elect Trump respecting these traditions when his party wins.
So do you think all this bodes well for a smooth transition of power between the two men?
I'd like to think that, but I'm not sure that today's headlines or the experience in 2020 gives much cause for optimism.
I mean, that was, of course, Donald Trump's first visit to the White House since he left back in January 2021. I mean, we have to admit, it's a pretty triumphant return for Donald Trump, isn't it?
It is. The circumstances under which he left were very unusual in American history. It's traditional that when a president leaves office, even if he's been defeated for re-election, he attends the inauguration of his successor. Then future President Trump just left the White House and did not attend President Biden's inaugural, and no one really doubts that President Biden will attend President Trump's inaugural. But you can't have, I think, time-honored traditions of American government and politics that are upheld only by one party in a two-party system.
So do you think Joe Biden was right to be so cordial and so gracious, given that Donald Trump didn't extend that same courtesy to him when he won back in 2020?
I think President Biden was right to behave as he did. To use a rather high-flown term, President Biden is what Americans call an institutionalist, someone who believes in the institutions of government apart from party labels. And to use a more down-to-earth and more recent term, he's a normie, someone who tries to uphold norms and tries to act normal. And I hope that we are not seeing the twilight of the institutionalists and the normies.
The two men are reported to have talked for about 2 hours. What sort of things do you think they talked about?
I don't know. You never get to be a fly on the American people never get to be a fly on the wall in these meetings, and you have to rely on whatever memoirs are written or whatever insider journalists and historians are able to piece together. I mean, having worked for former President Clinton, starting when he took office, I was very moved to read about how former President George H.W. Bush left him a note where he said that now that the election was over, he was, I think the phrase was, rooting big time for President Clinton's success. So you certainly hope that when you have a president and his successor meeting during a transition, that there's some shared commitment to what's good for the country, not just what's good for one party or one person.
Indeed, those anecdotes about transitions of years past seem very distant memories in the current world. And of course, that meeting, probably quite a bitter pill for Joe Biden to swallow. I mean, I know there were no flies on the wall and there's no one to tell us, but what do you think would have been going through Joe Biden's mind as he sat down for talks with Donald Trump by the fire, given how much baggage there is between the two men?
I honestly don't know and can't even begin to imagine. I know that I was someone who worked for a president, and I know that the first time I walked into the Oval Office, I felt a sense of awe just to be there as a staffer. And I can only imagine how a president feels showing up for work every day in the Oval Office. So you hope that, I mean, if there's any setting in American government that's designed to give the person sitting at a desk or sitting at a meeting a sense of awe and a sense that this is about history and not personality and not about partisanship, it's being in the Oval Office. And I just hope that they both talked about what's good for America.
Indeed, and they probably did, didn't they, find areas of common ground, areas where they may agree, notably, you mentioned the world, but notably on issues of national security, perhaps?
I'm sorry?
I wonder whether you think they would have found areas where they'd agree on issues of national security or foreign policy, perhaps.
I don't know. I think part of what happens in a transition, and this is a part I was in no way part of, is there are things that only a president and his most trusted staff know about the world situation and our country's national security, and that they need to pass along to the new president and the new president's team. And there's certainly more than 2 hours worth to talk about, even in the most general terms, about what's going on in the world right now, because it's a very troubled world. And there are things that a current president knows and the next president needs to know.
There were two notable absentees at the White House yesterday, at least we didn't see them. One is the current First Lady Jill Biden, the other is the former First Lady and the future First Lady Melania Trump. Why don't you think they respected the tradition and held the talks and the discussions that First Ladies usually hold?
I believe that the news, according to the news coverage, First Lady Joe Biden invited Melania Trump to the traditional meeting, and that Melania Trump did not accept. So I think one side did try to follow the tradition and the other did not.
And what do we read into the fact she didn't want to come and she breached protocol?
I don't know, but it's hard to take much encouragement from that as to what's going to happen during the transition and during the next 4 years.
Just casting our minds back to the election, where the result was obviously quite resounding and a clear defeat for the Democrats. There's obviously going to be some reflection on the part of the Democratic Party. What are your thoughts at this early stage as to what went so wrong for them?
Well, my personal view is that since 2016, the keys to the presidency has been about 7 swing states that are often called the blue wall. And out of those states, if I can remember every one of them in this context, and I've worked in all of these states, the decisive states include Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and those states are states where for the Democrats to win, we need working class voters. And in 2016, Hillary Clinton lost ground there. In 2020, Joe Biden gained back ground. And in 2024, sadly, Kamala Harris lost ground again. And I think we need to be a party that connects to our real base, which is not so much, or shouldn't be so much, demographic or cultural or educational, but it should be economic class. It should be working people from every background and every industry and every walk of life. And when we win and earn their support, we win. When we, for whatever reason, we lose it, we lose, and we need to win it back. And I think that's sort of a story of left of center parties around the world. I think it's the story of the British Labour Party, which won back the votes of its constituents and won back power. And it's in another way the story of the trouble that the German Social Democrats are in, and the French Socialists are in, and the Canadian Liberals and New Democrats are in, and so on. It's a worldwide challenge, so you can't just reduce it to what kind of campaign Vice President Harris ran. I think she ran a good campaign over.
So you don't blame Kamala Harris. You don't blame Kamala Harris. Would you blame therefore Joe Biden for not dropping out earlier?
I'm sorry?
Would you blame, therefore, Joe Biden for not dropping out of the race sooner than he did and not giving her enough time?
Well, hindsight is always 20/20. I think he did so much that was the right thing to do in the 2020 campaign and in his presidency, that it's sort of difficult to see when the moment was when he should have passed the baton. I think in hindsight, probably that moment was right after the 2022 midterm elections when he did well, the Democrats did well, and he could have said that he had been elected as a transitional figure, and now is the time to begin to pass the torch to a success, to serve out the remainder of his term and continue the job he was doing, but to set up a process to pass the torch to a successor. But it's always, hindsight is always 20/20, and it's very difficult to quit at any moment, especially at a high point.
Okay.
So,
but if you were to apportion blame somewhere, where and how would you apportion it?
I don't think there's, as I'm saying, I don't think there's really one or two or three people to apportion the blame to, because if you're going to do that, then you have to explain what's happening in Canada, what's happening in Germany, what's happening in France, what's happening around the world, where so many parties that are similar to the Democratic Party are facing terrible challenges. So I don't think you can reduce it to one or two people.
We've got less than 70 days left of the Biden administration. I mean, it does feel a little bit early to be looking back at his legacy, but at this early stage, how do you think people will look back on the presidency of Joe Biden?
I think they will look back on it a lot better than they told the pollsters. He came in at a very difficult moment when the country was facing an economic crisis, a medical crisis, a political crisis, and I'd say also a cultural crisis, where you had large segments of the country, the economy had been locked down, people had been locked up in their homes, schools had been shut down, and there was a disputed election conducted under difficult circumstances. And there's also the challenge of withdrawing from the forever war in Afghanistan. It was a very difficult set of challenges to undertake. I think he responded to them honorably. I think a lot of his legacy, ironically, is probably going to benefit Donald Trump if Donald Trump lets it benefit him, because it's not only a macro economy that's doing well, but there's also really unprecedented investments in parts of the country that have been left behind by the economy and that often voted for Donald Trump. And knowing Donald Trump, he's probably going to, when the roads and highways and computer chip factories and so on are built, he's probably going to claim credit for it and put his name on it, even though the decisions that led to these facilities being built were made at great cost, at great political cost during Joe Biden's administration.
And David, just lastly, I mean, going back to what you did for a living, which was writing speeches, and you did it for President Bill Clinton. When we started talking about Kamala Harris more than 100 days ago, when she became the party candidate, people felt like they didn't really know her very well. That changed slightly as the campaign went on. But in terms of whoever wrote the speeches for her, looking back on that, do you think they could have written them differently? Or do you think she could have communicated more effectively in such a way that she would have made people feel like they knew her and that she would have ultimately performed better in the polls?
I think that her speeches and whatever process produced them, it's always an interaction between the candidate and the staff, especially when you're in the last 100 days, which also turned out to be the first 100 days of a presidential campaign. I think she gave very good speeches. I think it's very different. Another, as if she didn't have enough challenges. Another challenge to overcome is running for president as a sitting vice president. And you just have to look at what happened to Al Gore, Hubert Humphrey, Richard Nixon in 1960, Walter Mondale 4 years after being a sitting vice president, in 1984, and so on. It's a very difficult challenge. I may be forgetting somebody, but I think that in recent memory, the only candidate who succeeded in going from vice president to president was the first George H.W. Bush in 1988. And he was succeeding a very popular president in Ronald Reagan.
Indeed. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. Really great talking to you once again. David Kusnet, thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Now, shifting our focus to Gaza, and a new report has called Israel's displacement of Palestinians there a war crime. Well, a report by Human Rights Watch slams what it called the forced displacement of the Strip's residents, describing it as, quote, a crime against humanity. Well, the law forbids the displacement of civilians from an occupied territory unless needed for security of civilians or for military reasons. Well, the full-scale war between Israel and Hamas began after the 7th of October attacks, and it's gone on to claim the lives of more than 43,500 Palestinians and around 1,200 Israelis. Well, with Donald Trump's incoming presidency, the future of the conflict in the Middle East is, of course, a key concern. Well, for more, I'm joined by the Palestinian ambassador to Denmark, Manuel Hassassian. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Ambassador. That was, of course, quite a damning report by Human Rights Watch. They talk about ethnic cleansing and they talk about the war crime of forcible transfers. What's your reaction to what that report said?
Well, this is not the first report that we have received condemning Israel of its record of genocide against the innocent Palestinians in Gaza. There have been many reports by international organizations talking about ethnic transfer, ethnic cleansing, the onslaughts on civilians, and what have you. So I'm not surprised by such a report. We believe that this report should be heard by the United States of America and by European countries to take a certain stand against Israel and its onslaught against the Palestinian people. So what is the use of producing such reports without any action or implementation or a decision taken against Israel to stop, first of all, the war, and second, to allow humanitarian assistance to our people in Gaza? So I'm not surprised.
It doesn't sound like you're very hopeful that this report will change anything, therefore.
No, as long as we have a biased U.S. administration that is supporting in an unwavering way, unequivocally, the state of Israel, I'm not that hopeful. And you can see how Congress has been playing into the hands of the U.S., of the Zionist lobby, AIPAC, in Washington, let alone the relationships of the current Biden administration with that of the President-elect Trump in the near future. That will give also the green light for Israel to continue with its, strategy of ethnic cleansing and trying to eradicate the Palestinian question once and for all by weakening the Palestinian Authority and by trying to create facts on the ground and by building settlements and by increasing, the numbers of settlements and natural growth and what have you. All these are signs that are not optimistic, but they are pessimistic. And we don't see except the worst coming down the pipeline in January, when President-elect will assume his office in January of 2025.
Now, Israel hasn't responded to that Human Rights Watch report, but in the past they've said things like we operate in accordance with international law. They also say they issue evacuation orders ahead of strikes. How do you respond to that sort of a reaction from Israel, which is what we can expect most likely to this report?
Since October 7th, with the total destruction militarily, administratively, economically, the entire Gaza, let alone the West Bank and East Jerusalem, what have you. So Israel does not really pay any heed to all these international organizations because they have the veto power of the United States. So they are not even concerned to take them into consideration and to try basically to answer them, because they think this is a report that will be forgotten within 48 hours, and that's it. Why? Because there is no mechanism of implementation of such reports through the United Nations that is totally helpless, hopeless, impotent when it comes to the implementation of such resolutions condemning Israel of its policies of discrimination, let alone its genocide and ethnic cleansing and ethnic transfer of the Palestinian people. So why should Israel bother, answering Amnesty International or answering Human Rights Watch or the Commission Rights for Human Rights and what have you? All these organizations, for them, are non-existent, and they can nullify all their decisions by just continuing with their practices against the Palestinians, totally supported by the United States, let alone the worst is coming down the pipeline when Trump will assume his presidency on January 20th, 2025. We are witnessing the worst coming with this new administration, much more even than we have been witnessing with the Biden administration. God knows what strategies they have been, trying to formulate against us. I mean, Trump, when we start the year 2025.
I just want to ask you to tell us a little bit more about why you're so concerned about the next Trump presidency, because we were given to understand that a lot of Arab Americans, a lot of Muslim Americans voted for Donald Trump precisely because he pledged to end the war in Gaza. Do you not believe his pledge that he can end this call using his relationships in the area, notably with the Israeli Prime Minister, to bring about a prompt end to this conflict?
Yes. First of all, you know that the Arab Americans and the Muslim communities, as a protest vote, they voted for Trump. It's not that they are in love with Trump, but they were disappointed with Kamala Harris and President Biden with their policies supporting, the state of Israel militarily, economically, politically, and what have you. Now, they have voted for Trump, believing that Trump would take a different course of action by the cessation of conflict and by the allowing of humanitarian aid. I tell you, my friend, there will be a new phase in Middle East politics by Trump administration. First of all, he is appointing Mark Huckabee as being the ambassador of the United States in Tel Aviv, and vice versa. Israel is also appointing a hawkish ambassador, basically, to the United States. Huckabee says very openly that there is nothing called West Bank. This is a title deed given by God to the chosen people, the Jewish people. There is nothing of a two-state solution. There is nothing of Jerusalem for the Palestinians. There is nothing of a two-state solution. This is the state of Israel, and there is no mention of Palestine. So what do you expect now when he assigns such a guy who has been supporter of settlements in the occupied territories as an ambassador to go to Israel? So you can read the letter from the headings of the envelope. This is not something that we should be very optimistic about. Second, Trump administration said it time and again that the state of Israel is a small state. It has to expand at the expense of the Palestinians. Thirdly, the cessation of war doesn't mean that the Palestinians will have their inalienable rights and their self-determination. So what do we expect from this president-elect who moved the embassy of the United States from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem? Now, he is the actual president as of January, and he is in total tune with Netanyahu. He's giving Netanyahu all the time he wants to continue with his war project, with his genocide against the Palestinians, And with the cessation, with the ceding of the West Bank to the State of Israel. And Smotrich had introduced a plan of dividing the West Bank territories into 3 areas as cluster areas to be ceded to the State of Israel. So you're talking about killing the two-state solution and the creation of the greater state of Israel by ceding the West Bank, Gaza and East Jerusalem, let alone expanding into the Jordan Valley, Egypt, Syria, and what have you. So this is the plan of President Trump. And this is the plan of Netanyahu, who has been procrastinating to stop the war because he doesn't want to be indicted for his,
his criminal
what we
woes,
call,
his legal woes, yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So from this perspective, I could conclude and say that Trump has the Middle East on his agenda, but his agenda is to dissect the entire Middle East, to extort more money from the Gulf, and to initiate again his Abrahamic Accords and try to solve the Palestinian question once and for all, and not to solve the Israeli question in the Arab world.
All right, I'm afraid we're out of time. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much, though, for taking the time to speak to us. Palestinian Ambassador to Denmark, Manuel Hassassian. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.
We go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome to Al Arabiya News. I'm your host, Michal Prendergast. I'm thrilled to say I'm joined by the star of Shark Tank USA and millionaire investor, Kevin O'Leary. So Kevin, the world has been shocked about the return of Donald Trump. Are you shocked?
No. The Democratic Party lost its way. They're no longer in touch with the electorate. There was a certain arrogance they had, and I think the problem started when Biden left the ticket, because in the democratic process, usually you have a convention, and so you start from scratch, and that process weeds out any weakness in candidates. If they have an inability to articulate their position, for example, or they're not able to debate their colleagues or whatever. But the other advantage of the convention, and there's been many very famous conventions back as far as the 40s, 50s, and 60s, is that the party realigns itself with a new message because it's trying to figure out what's the best candidate for the times. And they also get a tremendous amount of press, almost 5-6 weeks of press. That's not what happened here. What occurred was, I don't know if you want to call them the party elite, but the Pelosi's, the Schumers, the Obama,
the deep
even
state,
some movie stars, they said, well, we're going to anoint Harris. And that was a mistake because Harris, while a very fine person, I'm sure, has never won anything. And last time she tried this, she didn't get a single delegate. So in 2020, in 2019, she failed. 2020, she failed. She failed again in 2024. The analogy I think that is best serving this thing is the Super Bowl of all political contests on earth is the American presidential election. There's no greater political event on earth. And if your quarterback gets injured, which is what Biden was, you don't put in a new quarterback that's never played a game or ever won one, ever. they got shellacked, and they've learned an important lesson. I looked at that map, the electoral map, while covering the election. It was turning redder than a lobster being boiled. I mean, he just took the nation. And I think they're doing a little soul searching now. But they had it coming to them. And as I like to say, Trump did them a huge favor. He actually helped that party. They don't know it yet, but they're going to have to take a spatula to it and scrape all of those candidates away and start from scratch with new leadership. They'll be a very competitive party. There's a lot of talent in the Democratic Party that never got a chance to compete. Now they will.
Yeah, and speaking of Donald Trump, I've heard you say every Democrat has to thank him for saving American entrepreneurship and the American economy.
Yeah, the concept, some of the ideas being proposed, specifically taxing unrealized gains, that's un-American. The idea of price controls, Soviet-style price controls, that's un-American. The focus on gender identity was not the #1 concern of people that can't even afford chicken on their kitchen table. So when you get that lost, the system corrects itself, and that's exactly what happened. That's the amazing thing about democracy. When you try and stretch it too far in any direction, boom, it self-corrects. Now, you happen to be in the way of the self-correction, you get decimated, and that's what happened to that party.
Yes, and the effect of social media has been really interesting. Obviously, Elon Musk has played a huge part. Obviously, he paid $44 billion. Do you see that as a good investment in the future of free speech?
Well, as an investment, it wasn't a good investment because it's valued now at $11 to $12 billion. But that doesn't matter. What he did do is keep alive the concept of free speech, because in a democracy, you're always dealing with 2.5% lunatic fringe. The cost of freedom of speech is the lunatic fringe. The minute you try and shut down the lunatic fringe, you're moving away from the concept freedom of speech. Everybody has a voice. You may not like what they say, but because they're part of the narrative, that is the core and the DNA of democracy. And so many ideas get tested, some get thrown out. And when you try and change that, again, the system self-corrects, and that's what happened here. So it's a very divided country now. We are going to have a new president with a full mandate. I mean, it looks like he's going to win the Senate and the House and the presidency. You can get a lot done for the first 2 years when you control everything. And so that's what's going to happen.
And obviously Trump in his first 4 years, it might have been called a little inexperienced. I think this time he won't mess around.
Well, he's actually signaled the market that he intends to hire seasoned veterans, AAA players, that don't have a mandate to go in the White House and write a book 6 weeks later after they're fired. He doesn't want that. He doesn't want a rotating door anymore. He wants A players, and he's grooming his, he's got some very interesting people working on the inside to find the right people for every single position in cabinet. And I think it's going to be a fantastic government, because it's going to focus on what the people want. They want security at the border. They've already said that. They want a reduction in inflation. The way you do that is you reduce energy costs. They want to strip away all the regulatory environment that the Biden administration put on. $1 trillion worth of burdensome regulation. He will tear that off like a Band-Aid, rip it right off, and the economy, as you can see, indexed by the market, the buoyancy that happened as soon as they figured out that he was going to be president, was pretty happy with that outcome. This is good for business. And when the economy is buoyant and people are getting employed, it's good for everybody. So, you know, the Democrats are licking their wounds, but in 6 weeks, everybody forget about it, and we'll move on. It'll be a great thing for everybody. I think the U.S. is in a renaissance period. And I'm not really shilling for politicians. I never do that. I shill for policy. I care about policy. I care about entrepreneurship. I care about investing. I care about the American dream. I'm an ambassador for it. I want that to work, because my family, you know, is American, and they're working in the U.S. I want the best we can get for that country every day, and this is how you do it.
And speaking in terms of efficiency, Elon Musk has famously, he got rid of 85% of Twitter, and it's still running pretty flawlessly. There's been a lot of speculation that he might get the Secretary of State for Government Efficiency. Would you like to see that? What could someone like Elon Musk do in terms of saving tax dollars?
I don't think he'll take an actual specific role in cabinet. I think what he will do is be a consultant for the American people, identify inefficiencies, and get the whacking stick out. I love that idea. I love the idea that we've never really scraped the fat out of the federal government, and it's big, porky, fat, dripping with opportunity to cut. But the only way you can do that is you need a mandate from the top dog, the president, because no agency wants to be downsized. You walk in saying, I want to fire a third of you. They're not going to help you. But he'll identify opportunity. I call it release the hounds, because what taxpayer, regardless of what your politics are, red or blue or independent, who wouldn't want to save money by just chopping out all the waste in the federal government? And I think if there's one man that has the ability to do that, proven executional skills, it's Elon Musk. So I really endorse this idea.
Well, I think it could be a great team, obviously, with Donald Trump and the art of the deal. To speak on the international scale, with tariffs, obviously it's a word that Trump has bandied around a lot. What does that mean for, I suppose, the average Joe in America and for the future of international trade? We're looking at China, we're looking at EV production. What do Trump's tariffs mean?
So tariffs were used as a form of rhetoric, weaponry during the election cycle. Harris called them sales tax, like a VAT tax that we have in Europe. That's not what they are. In fact, there's a bill cruising around the Hill right now in the U.S. It's a tariff reciprocal act. And what it says is any of our trading partners that impose tariffs will put a reciprocal, identical tariff. So if Germany puts 10% on cars, we'll put 10% on their cars coming to the U.S., that kind of thing. And of course, there's a new act, the new NAFTA 2.0, if you want to call it that governs Canada, the United States, and Mexico, big trading partners. The one entity that I think you're going to see a lot more pressure on is China. China doesn't abide by the rules of the WTO. They joined in 1999 with all kinds of promises to play by the rules. They never did. So I'm an advocate for using tariffs to squeeze their heads like teenage pimples. And the way I make that is, point that out, is to say, look, the only way a supreme leader stays in power perpetually is everybody has bread and butter. You have to have a job. Otherwise, you ride against the supreme leader. And that's just the way it is in a communist dictatorship. So the way you squeeze the supreme leader's head is you say, look, let's pick a sector. I'm just going to use an example. Yoga mats. Let's say the U.S. orders 1 million yoga mats a week from China. You put a 400% tariff on it. And all the people making yoga mats in China lose their jobs. And they don't have any bread and butter anymore. And the supreme leader goes, oh my goodness, I don't have any jobs for these yoga mat makers. And then you say, well, where else can we inflict some damage? Let's do it in this sector. Put on 400% tariff there. Squeezing that teenage pimple till it pops. Then he gets on an airplane and flies to Washington saying, just kidding, just kidding. I want to work out and be part of the, reciprocal tariff act. Because China only understands the stick. They don't understand anything else.
It's a game of chicken.
Well, Trump scares his adversaries because he's unpredictable. He's just very unpredictable. When you know what your adversary is going to do all the time and they signal it to you beforehand, you're not scared of him anymore. They're scared shitless of Trump. And that's, excuse my French, but that's basically how it works. That's why you're seeing all these guys saying, oh, we want to have peace now. No, we want to stop. Because he's very unpredictable. So in the case of China, squeezing the supreme leader to the table is a good thing. So I would like to go to 400% tariffs. Because I do business in China. They don't play by the rules.
And how about on EVs? Because obviously, even a 20% or even a 30% tariff on EVs, I believe in the EU, they're trying to flood the market. Obviously, Germany's not happened. We've seen that Volkswagen cut 1,000 jobs in 2 months ago.
The point is, tariffs are temporary. They're a negotiating tactic. But if you're going to put them on, don't screw around. Go to 400%. Make it impossible for them to sell any widgets anywhere. So if you put 400% on an EV, no one's going to buy it. Only the Chinese can buy it. So all the people making the EVs, no bread, no butter. That's how you do it. Now, if I was the minister of Chinese head squeezing, that's how I would do it. And believe me, they will be at the table so fast because they cannot afford to have unemployment in that economy. And it's showing some cracks there. So you want to hit them while they're down and bring them to the table. They cheat on IP, they steal, you can't use their courts. Good example that people should focus on is Twitter, or not Twitter, but TikTok. TikTok has been deemed Chinese spyware by the American Congress. That's a bipartisan bill. By midnight on Jan 19th in the U.S., the servers are going to get turned off.
I've heard you say as well that you would like to buy it,
I would.
a consortium. Do you want to buy Twitter?
Yeah,
TikTok?
I would definitely buy TikTok. I would buy it because it's a great, it depends what I get with it. If I don't get the algorithm, all I'm getting is a mailing list, so I pay a lot less for that. But we'll see how this goes because, remember, they did this in India. After 4 years, they had 200 million users on it, and the supreme leader would not, play by the rules with the Indian government, and they said, we'll just turn it off. And everybody was squeamish for a week, and then they forgot about it. They just drifted onto other social media platforms. So again, squeezing the supreme leader's head there is good. And it is spyware. I would never put that on a phone that I have sensitive data on. It's Chinese spyware. Everybody knows that. That's why it's shut down. They just shut it down in Canada. I mean, they're going to shut it down everywhere. But this is the arrogance of the supreme leader. He doesn't care. So you've got to squeeze his head. He will appreciate the head squeezing. He will thank you for it.
And is it the same, obviously, with the likes of Vladimir Putin and the war between Israel and Hamas? War is not good for business. Do you think Trump is going to have a large enough impact? He said famously, I will stop the wars within the first day of office. Do you think that's true?
Putin understands force. Not a very nice guy. He's killed a lot of people. But 25,000 young Russians a month lose their lives. He's buying their services now. There's no more patriots left. You get coffin money, your family gets a house, but you go die or get blown up. That's pretty brutal. So I would think giving him a call and saying, look, I've been thinking about this war. I don't like it. I don't want to pay for the Ukrainian costs, and I want it to stop. Come to the table, or I'll do something that will really surprise you, which is probably what people worry about with Trump, because we saw how he ended the Syrian conflict by just saying, I'm going to kill this guy. And he did. And I think that kind of erratic nature is what these adversaries worry about. Now, a lot of NATO players don't like to hear this, but I think war's horrible. I think all these people and children losing their lives is horrible. It's just, somebody has to stop this.
Exactly, and on a human level, but as well as obviously markets. So
the world
affects
is
the bread and butter as well. So you're taking food off of people's tables, affecting jobs, as well as the human suffering. It's bad all around.
It is. So I think people are willing to try a different way. Now, whether Trump's successful or not, we'll see. But this carnage of death of young children, I can't watch it anymore. No one can.
Of course.
It's got to stop.
Then, moving on to cryptocurrency, we've seen markets as well as the price of Bitcoin increase. It broke $72,000, I believe, in the past few days. Do you believe under Trump, what is the height that you think it can get to under a Trump presidency?
So Trump has signaled, and the market knows this, that he is in favor of digital payment system, which includes Bitcoin, which is an asset class. I'm not saying that's a digital payment system, but it's no different than gold. I mean, you can own some gold, you can own some Bitcoin. I own both. What the problem is, we don't have institutional support for it yet because it's not regulated in the U.S. The way other commodities are. So the rumor on the street is that the CFTC, which regulates commodities, is going to get the mandate for crypto, and they're looking for someone to run it. And they'll probably take a lot of that away from Gensler at the SEC, who's been litigating this sector, and successfully, I might add. He's, all the crypto cowboys, like Binance, CZ, he's a felon now. You know what happened to Sam Bankman-Fried. So people that took on Gensler all lost, and this is probably a good thing. So we move into a phase now where it's going to be regulated. There's a lot of optimism about it. Here in Abu Dhabi, we have the M2 exchange, which is a a very interesting idea because it's completely compliant with its regulator. I see a lot of upside coming in crypto.
And a figure, just briefly, do you think, what's the limit? Do you think it can reach 200K under a Trump presidency?
I think we'll all see 100,000 shortly. I feel everybody should have 5% weighting in gold in their portfolio. Nothing wrong with 5% weighting in Bitcoin. I mean, why not? I mean, unless you really think, and you don't have to do this, I'm just saying alternative asset classes in times of uncertainty and inflation are good. I mean, I own gold and I've had it my whole life. I was given a locket from my Irish father when I was 11 years old that had a gold coin in it. That's when I fell in love with it. I've had that ever since. And I own bullion, I own ETFs. I mean, gold is gold. The Romans loved it, I love it. You know, Bitcoin is the new. It's not as old as gold, but it's performed very well for me.
Yeah. And just lastly, speaking on gold, obviously to have Kevin O'Leary, Mr. Wonderful in the studio, it would be a shame if I didn't ask about watches. You are, I would say, the most famous watch collector in the world now, doing millions of views on YouTube every month with the likes of Teddy Baldassar. He has just opened his new watch shop. I want to ask you, would you ever think of entering the watch strap business? The red bands are... They're synonymous with you.
It's a great question, but you know, what I've learned about watch collecting and getting access, I mean, the thing that in my journey into horology is, in order to get watchmakers that are really unique, who make only a few pieces a year, you need to be known as a collector. And what does that mean? It means that you support the art. It's no different than contemporary art, and you don't flip them. So flipping a watch, when you get a reputation for buying it at the entry price from the watchmaker and then turning around and selling it for 4 times that the next week, you're not a collector, you're just a flipper. And the watch community is very small. You know, in terms of the makers, there's probably 25 makers of consequence worldwide. The word gets out overnight that you're not a real collector. And so it takes a long time to earn the trust of an F.P. Journe or a Simon Britt or any of these makers. And I'm known I've never sold a watch. And so I have a very vast collection, and I'm a dial guy, as you know. So I'm always looking for the new dial. I'm wearing a Moser, a unique dial here. And of course, this is a classic Daytona. I thought, this is New York time, this is Abu Dhabi time. And so I support. The thing about getting into the business of retailing watches or retailing bands is all of a sudden...
I'd buy it, Kevin.
Yeah, no, I'm
100%.
You're no longer a collector.
Penny for an O'Leary band.
But I'm very fortunate. Every watch company knows I won't wear it unless it has a red band. So they don't even offer me watches if they can't put a red band on. I would never buy them. So my whole thing's red band because it looks fantastic. Great with gold, great with platinum. I mean, this looks gorgeous. Works with my red.
Of course.
I just wonder if
on Shark Tank.
Yeah, the whole thing is, you know, it's just over the years it's become one of my things. But each maker, watches are really a beautiful thing because they mark a period in your life. Every time I do a big deal, I buy a new watch, and I associate that deal with that watch. And you know, my daughters try and steal them, my wife, my son. Nobody gets to touch my watches. Like, that's it. That's the one thing that I've got. They're in vaults all around the world, you know, and I just love it. I just have so much fun. And the reason I like it is the community of watch collectors that I know all around the world are very eclectic. Surgeons, artists, financiers, royalty, you name it. And
journalists?
Yes, journalists. We share the passion of watches, and I think it enriches my life.
Great. Kevin O'Leary, a millionaire investor, host of the Smash Hit Show at Shark Tank. Thank you so much for your time.
You got it. Thank you.
From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deep fake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers.
My campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on The Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.